Chapter 971. Wuming wasn't afraid of the trace of poisonous gas produced by Basumu's poison. Even if he inhaled the poisonous gas into his body, it wouldn't be a big deal. After all, the immunity effect would have some effect. But if it was a sea of poison on the scale of a flood, it would be a different story. Moreover, looking at the poisonous liquid that was rapidly spreading on the ground below like a flood, Wuming inexplicably felt a trace of disgust. This made Wuming feel that it would be better for him to fly into the sky. Let's not talk about other things first. This poisonous liquid looked really disgusting. After all, it was spat out by Basumu's mouth. This made Wuming directly reject the plan of using the Heaven Lock to deal with Basumu. Even if Enkidu wasn't afraid of poison, he didn't want Enkidu to be stained with this stuff. He guessed that Enkidu wouldn't want to either. The venom spread all over the ground, and even Gorgon was caught in it. But for some reason, Gorgon wasn't affected by the poisonous liquid. Was it because he was the goddess of magical beasts, or was he affected by the black mud? Looking at Gorgon, whose wounds had completely healed, Wuming couldn't help but think so. The black mud gushing out of Gorgon's wounds had also stopped, but the black mud didn't spread. It just wrapped around Gorgon's body. That was why Wuming guessed that it was because of the black mud that Gorgon wasn't affected by the poisonous liquid. Then Wuming flew directly to Gorgon. Due to the recovery of his self-healing ability, Gorgon's magic eye that was originally destroyed by Wuming was now slowly recovering. The magic eye was a big killer for Gorgon, but it was also a very troublesome existence for Wuming, so Wuming couldn't wait for Gorgon's magic eye to recover. The so-called, take advantage of someone's illness, was the current situation. Gorgon's demon eye had yet to recover, and the snake hair alone was not enough to stop Wuming's advance. Therefore, Gorgon could be said to be a lamb waiting to be slaughtered by Wuming. However, Basumu'u would not let Wuming kill Gorgon. Basumu'u was like a loach, slipping through the sea of venom it spewed out. In an instant, he arrived in front of Wuming, blocking his path. Roar! Following Basumu'u's roar, countless amounts of venom were sprayed out by Basumu, which made Wuming instantly retreat far away. You're really annoying. Wuming, who had retreated to a distance and cursed, raised the divine blade of salvation. Holy light gathered on the divine blade of salvation, gradually illuminating the surroundings like a flash bomb. Divine blade of salvation, show the light of salvation and bring peace to the world. With the infusion of magic power from Wuming, the venom was illuminated by the light of the divine blade of salvation. In the next second, the venom began to gradually dissipate as if it had met its natural enemy. It did not turn into gas, but directly disappeared. As the name suggested, the light of salvation that came with the divine blade of salvation had a strong effect on these filthy things. Not only did the divine blade of salvation have an effect on the venom, but it also reacted to Basumu, who released it. Roar! Basumu let out a blood-curdling scream, as if a vampire was directly exposed to the sun. His whole body emitted purple smoke. Ah! Gorgon seemed to be slightly affected as well. A trace of the power of the divine blade of salvation reacted to the black mud on Gorgon's body, causing Gorgon great pain. My son! My Basumu! Destroy him! Gorgon roared as if he had gone mad. He felt even more abnormal than before. However, Basumu could not take care of himself at this moment. Like a loach, he rolled around in the gradually disappearing sea of venom. But in the next second, as if it had reached its limit, the black mud on Gorgon's body began to spread. At this moment, Gorgon was like a fountain of black mud gushing out endlessly. A large amount of black mud covered the venom on the ground, and Basumu was also covered by the black mud. Not good. Wuming could not help but be shocked. He knew better than anyone what would happen to an existence eroded by the black mud. Every existence eroded by the black mud would become hostile to Wuming, and their strength would greatly increase. Sure enough, Basumu, who was no longer rolling around after being covered by the black mud, slowly stood up. His originally dark green body had turned into a black snake, and his forelimbs had disappeared for some reason. It could be said that he had turned into a snake in the truest sense. Gorgon, who had become the fountain of the black mud, was now completely covered by the black mud. She abandoned Wuming and walked towards the north wall, which surprised Wuming. If Gorgon went to the north wall, then the people in the north wall would definitely be finished. Even if they had servants, it would be useless. Gorgon, who had obtained Tiamat's authority, could not be dealt with by the number of servants. Now that he was covered by the black mud, it was really a big crisis. Wuming subconsciously wanted to stop Gorgon, but someone stopped him first. Hiss! Ba Xiumu, who had turned into a black snake, appeared in front of Wuming. He made a strange roar and directly opened his mouth to bite Wuming. In an instant, Wuming was swallowed by Ba Xiumu. However, a few seconds later, a light appeared on Ba Xiumu's stomach. The next second, the light exploded and Wuming flew out from it. Because of the light of salvation, Wuming was not contaminated with the poison. No, it should be said that he was not contaminated with the black mud. Ba Xiumu, who had been eroded by the black mud, had turned into black mud. His mouth and stomach were full of black mud, but it was also full of poison. This guy's speed has become a lot faster. If Wuming could still look down on Ba Xiumu before, now that Wuming was facing Ba Xiumu, who had been eroded by the black mud, he could no longer do so. The previous Ba Xiumu was only poisonous, but now Ba Xiumu was not only poisonous and had the black mud, but his physical fitness was also much stronger than the other monster commanders Wuming had seen. Looking in the direction of Gorgon, Wuming found that there was a big hole in the direction Gorgon was going, and Gorgon was long gone. It seemed that Gorgon had drilled into the ground through this hole. However, Gorgon's destination would not change. It was definitely going to the north wall. However, Wuming could not leave now. As for why Wuming split Ba Xiumu, who was rushing over with his sword, and frowned more and more. It was a fact that he could not leave, but he could not let this guy go. The current Gorgon was dangerous, but the current Ba Xiumu was even more dangerous. Its poison and black mud were much more dangerous than Gorgon. Wuming held the blade of salvation horizontally in his hand, and his face became firm. He had to get rid of this guy here. Chapter 972. Roar! Wuming swung the blade of salvation and rushed towards Ba Xiumu. The blade of salvation with the black root soil was a lethal weapon for Ba Xiumu at this moment. Hiss! Ba Xiumu wasn't afraid of Wuming either. He let out a strange roar and also charged at Wuming. Ba Xiumu quickly swung his body, which had become more agile after losing his forelimbs, in an attempt to distract Wuming so that Wuming could not determine from which side he would attack from. However, Wuming did not pay attention to Ba Xiumu's head at all. He stared closely at a certain part of Ba Xiumu's body, the so-called 7 inches part. Wuming did not know if the so-called 7 inches was Ba Xiumu's weakness, but Wuming had seen before that Ba Xiumu's body was covered by an extremely thick breastplate from the head down to the chest. Defense naturally existed in the strongest part, but it was often the weakest part. It was precisely because it was weak that it needed the strongest defense. Just like how Godatsi, as a master, was extremely weak, so she needed Matthew's protection. It was the same principle. Therefore, Wuming guessed that the part of Ba Xiumu's chest that was covered with armor was its weakness. Ba Xiumu and Wuming did not slow down at all. At the moment when they were about to meet, Ba Xiumu launched an attack from Wuming's left side by constantly swaying, opening his poisonous mouth to bite Wuming. Looking at the huge poisonous needle in Ba Xiumu's mouth, if this bite hit, Wuming was afraid that he would directly leave. However, Wuming turned a deaf ear to this poisonous mouth and stared straight at Ba Xiumu's chest. I am the strongest and the one who holds all victory in my hands. No matter if it is a human or a demon, I will defeat any enemy that stands in my way. Giant with supreme power, give me your aid. Wuming's words left his mouth. In an instant, just as Ba Xiumu's fangs were about to touch Wuming's skin, a golden substance appeared on Wuming's body and blocked Ba Xiumu's attack. That was the byproduct of the giant incarnation. It was the substance that could form a golden giant around Wuming. Then, Wuming chanted the spirit of words. All evildoers, be afraid of my power. Now I will obtain the majesty of 10 mountains, the strength of 100 rivers, and the strength of 1,000 dragons. What the majestic me brings is the mark of the dragon seed that calls for victory. After the incantation, the golden substance instantly condensed and attached itself to Wuming in the form of a dragonoid. It then grabbed Basumu in its hand. This was the effect of the dragon seed incarnation on the giant incarnation. Ba Xiumu, who had never seen such a scene, was shocked. He tried to break free from the dragonoid's hand, but to no avail. That was to be expected. The giant incarnation had unparalleled strength, while the dragon seed incarnation had the attribute of a dragon. In terms of strength, Ba Xiumu was inferior to the giant incarnation. In terms of attribute, Ba Xiumu also had the attribute of a dragon. No matter what, it would be defeated. For a moment, Ba Xiumu was at his wits' end. However, Ba Xiumu's strongest point had always been his poison. Sizzle! The dragonoid's hand that grabbed Ba Xiumu began to dissolve because of the poison on Ba Xiumu's body. But Wuming didn't have the slightest knowledge of this. Wuming raised the divine blade of salvation, and an identical divine blade of salvation appeared in the giant dragonoid's hand. However, the divine blade of salvation was made of pure energy just like the dragonoid. However, this divine blade of salvation in the form of energy also had the power of the divine blade of salvation in Wuming's hand. Divine blade of salvation, burst forth with the thunder of salvation, help me eliminate the world's suffering. Along with Wuming's words, the dragonoid raised the divine blade of salvation in its hand. Kacha! Suddenly, a thunder from the cloudless sky suddenly fell on the divine blade of salvation, and the entire divine blade of salvation made of energy instantly became real. It felt like a real divine blade of salvation. The whole Mesopotamia seemed to have heard the thunder. Whether it was demonic beasts, humans, or servants, they couldn't help but look up at the sky. But then they returned to the matter in front of them, which was fighting. On Wuming's side, Ba Xiumu, who was tightly held in the dragonoid's hand, showed fear. He was already struggling, but now he was struggling even more fiercely, as if his body was about to break. Kacha! Another thunder, but the sound was not as loud as before. Splat! Ba Xiumu, who had been cut in half, kept flopping on the ground like a dehydrated fish. The broken part was the part below the head and above the chest, which was the so-called 7 inches. This caused Ba Xiumu, who had been cut in half, to look like his tail was several times longer than his head. Ba Xiumu did not break in half by himself, but by the divine blade of salvation. The second thunder came from the divine blade of salvation, which was what Ba Xiumu wanted. He successfully escaped from the dragonoid's hand. However, Ba Xiumu, who had escaped from the dragonoid's hand and fell to the ground, slowly stopped flopping. It seemed like Wuming's guess was right. That was Ba Xiumu's weakness. Enemies eroded by the black origin mud would indeed pose a threat to Wuming, but not every enemy was as powerful as Gidia. Even if Ba Xiumu was strengthened by the black origin mud, he was still no match for Wuming after Wuming attacked his weakness. However, as the saying goes, cut the grass and dig up the roots. Who knew if Ba Xiumu was faking it? It would be bad if Ba Xiumu bit Wuming when he let his guard down or left Wuming. After all, snakes were also creatures that knew how to deceive. The dragonoid raised the divine blade of salvation again, but this time it was not the thunder of salvation, but the light of salvation. Huff! A flame appeared at the tip of the divine blade of salvation. The flame gradually grew bigger, and slowly became an existence comparable to the sun. Wuming had used this sun many times. This was another way to use the light of salvation. The original illumination of all things was only a low-level light of salvation. When it turned into a flame, it was the true manifestation of the light of salvation. It was a light that was enough to kill Bashumu. Hiss! Bashumu let out a strange roar again, but this time, his voice was filled with the fear of death. Purify the filth, light of salvation. As Wuming whispered softly, the sun, on the divine blade of salvation was like a fountain of flames. It continued to radiate flames to the surroundings, enveloping Bashumu, the black origin mud on his body, and the poison that was mixed with the black origin mud in the surroundings. The black origin mud and the poison were all destroyed by the light of salvation, which contained the power of the origin. Bashumu, on the other hand, died completely in the sound of burning flames. Chapter 973. While Wuming was killing Bashumu, the beasts in the north wall were resting. The reason was that the commanders of the beasts were fighting near the north wall. Behind a relatively hidden mound, a gigantic seven-headed serpent was fighting with a white-clothed green-haired man. The two were precisely Musamaf and the fake that had taken over Enkidu's body. However, he couldn't be called the fake Enkidu, so he decided to call him Jingu for now. Hissed, as a huge seven-headed snake, Musumafu didn't rush up to fight with Jingu. Instead, he fought with Jingu like a kite, as if he didn't want to launch a severe attack on Jingu, but also didn't want Jingu to leave. Kingu had a tangled expression on his face. As the son of the Warcraft goddess, Jingu had heard Gorgon's roar just now. Although Jingu was helpless to be regarded as a traitor by Gorgon, it could not be helped. He did not say it in front of that person, otherwise his brain would be affected. There was another thing that made Kingu feel helpless. The other commanders really treated him as a traitor. He wasn't a traitor. Even if he was, he couldn't fight with Musamaf, who was also a commander. Fortunately, Musamaf didn't have the intention to fight. Musamaf, I know you are afraid of me. You don't have to be like this. I don't have the intention to betray Mother. Musamaf was known to be a two-faced fence-sitter among the demon commanders. In the beginning, because there were more humanoid demon commanders than beast-type demon commanders, Musamaf had the intention to switch sides with the humanoid demon commanders. When he and Yukur fell into the underworld that was blasted open by Ishtar, he even used Yukur to send him to Ereshki Gal to his death, thus covering his escape from the underworld. After that, when he saw that the humanoid demon commanders had lost their advantage, he turned back to the beast-type demon commanders. Jingu himself wasn't interested in the division of magical beast commanders, but even he couldn't help but feel extreme disgust towards Musamaf, who was two-faced and disobedient in public but opposed in private. In Kingu's view, this guy wasn't qualified to be his brother. After Gorgon issued an urgent command to the demons, Basumu, who was commanding the demons to attack the north wall with Musamaf, rushed to Gorgon's side. Musamaf, who had volunteered to stay behind, was given the order by Basumu to kill Jingu, who had betrayed their mother goddess. However, Musamaf was a two-faced and cowardly commander. How could he fight Kingu to the death? This made Kingu look down on Musamaf even more. I think you have felt it too. Basumu has just died. The reason why you are here is because you are afraid of being killed by that man. That man will come here soon. If you continue to waste time with me, you will be killed by that man in the end. The commanders of the beasts had telepathy. Kingu had felt it when Basumu was killed by Wuming. Kingu believed that Musamaf must have felt it too, and Kingu was prepared to use this to scare Musamaf away. However, the cowardly Musamaf didn't show any signs of retreating even though his 7 heads showed a trace of fear. This was because he had also sensed that his mother goddess was rushing over. The fear on Musamaf's 7 heads was only because he was afraid of the man Kingu had mentioned. He had stayed behind voluntarily because he was afraid of being killed by that man when he went to support his mother goddess. Sure enough, Basumu, who had gone to support his mother goddess, was killed. Although that man had already begun to rush over, the mother goddess was also rushing over. In fact, the mother goddess was 1 step ahead of that man. With the protection of the mother goddess, there was no need for him to be afraid. Kacha! A huge figure appeared from this huge rift valley. It was Gorgon, who had been corroded by the black mud. The originally pure white wings with a hint of gold had turned pitch black, and the purple snake hair had also turned dark purple. The originally pitch black scales had become even more filthy, as if they were full of curses. Finally, Gorgon's originally pure white skin was now shrouded in a black fog. Only his demonic eyes still shone with an ominous purple light. Being tainted by the black mud in the Rift Valley, Gorgon had become even crazier than an avenger. Kingu! You betrayed me! Gorgon, whose mind was already somewhat abnormal, bent down with a ferocious expression. He looked at Kingu in front of him and roared furiously, filled with the desire for revenge. Mother, you were too anxious and made the wrong judgment. As the child of the goddess of magical beasts, I would never betray her. Kingu faced Gorgon's huge head without showing any signs of being misunderstood. There was only calmness and a smile on his face. Gorgon widened her purple demonic eyes and looked at Kingu crazily, without saying a word. After a short while, Gorgon slowly raised her body, perhaps admitting that she had made the wrong judgment. In short, Gorgon didn't look for trouble with Kingu. Kingu smiled when he saw this and then flew to Gorgon's ear. Mother, the landing of Kururu in the Persian Gulf was very successful, and Azumughar is also entangled with Quizzard. Now we just need to break through the north wall and the humans will be in our pocket. Without responding to Kingu, Gorgon directly began to give orders. Magical beasts! Listen to my orders! The magical sound like a sound wave filled the minds of the magical beasts in the north wall. The magical beasts that were resting at the north wall all stood up. Destroy the humans! As soon as Gorgon's order came out, countless magical beasts rushed to the north wall. Musumafu also rushed to the north wall with the magical beasts. It could be seen that although Musumafu was two-faced and timid, as long as it was the order of the goddess, he would carry it out to the end. This was also the reason why Kingu didn't take the opportunity to get rid of Musumafu even though he hated him. When the guards on the northern wall saw this scene, they all became absent-minded. Some of them even dropped their weapons. They were desperate. Chapter 974. It's really come to this. Despair filled their hearts. Seeing this, Leonidas silently made a judgment. However, they couldn't be blamed for this. Facing the gigantic serpent god Gorgon in the distance and facing so many magical beasts, even Leonidas, who had led 300 men to fight against tens of thousands of enemies, couldn't help but feel fear. If they were facing an army of humans, perhaps they wouldn't lose their fighting spirit. However, they were facing incomprehensible magical beasts. After all, magical beasts weren't humans. They were existences that couldn't be defeated in a one-on-one battle. In the face of magical beasts that outnumbered the soldiers by several times, it was natural that the soldiers would choose to give up and despair. However, even if everyone gave up, Leonidas wouldn't give up. People could fall into confusion and despair, but he couldn't. Because he was the epitome of history, the hero of human history. He was the undead spirit that led humans to the future. Since the people were in despair, then as a heroic spirit, he had to give them hope. Since they couldn't stop the magical beasts, then he would be the one to stop them. Leonidas had promised Wuming that he would defend the northern wall while Wuming wasn't around. Even if they had only met a few times, Leonidas wouldn't go back on his word. With that thought in mind, Leonida jumped off the north wall and landed in front of one of the portals. General Leonidas? Some of them shouted in fright, but most of them were already speechless. Ignoring the situation of the people on the northern wall, Leonidas looked straight ahead and silently watched the demons charging towards him. Step by step, he walked forward. At this moment, it would be a lie to say that he wasn't afraid. At this moment, Leonidas was nervous and afraid, but more than that, he was excited from the bottom of his heart. This scene was much more magnificent than when he led 300 elites to fight against the Persian army. When he faced the Persian army, he was nervous, afraid, and other negative emotions. He was afraid that he would fail, and if he failed, his family and the people of Sparta would be ravaged by the Persian army. Leonidas was worried about everything. However, something happened. While Leonidas was nervous, it was his 300 friends who were watching. In the end, they helped Leonidas resolve the confusion in his heart. Therefore, even if he had become a heroic spirit and a servant, Leonidas didn't think that he was the one who stopped the Persian army at the hot spring gate. That was the shared glory of the 300 Spartans, including Leonidas. And this glory that belonged to the 300 Spartans had been sublimated into his noble phantasm. At some point, blue flames appeared behind Leonidas as he walked forward, and the number of flames was still increasing. That was the soul fire. Countless soul fires turned into human figures. They were all warriors with spears and shields. They were the 300 Spartan warriors. The blue flames were their soul fires. And Leonidas' noble phantasm was to summon the souls of the 300 Spartans to reenact the battle of the hot spring gate. When the demonic beasts were about to approach, Leonidas stopped and knocked the ground with his spear. "If you want to die, come and get it." The 300 Spartans repeated Leonidas' words and knocked the ground twice with their spears. "If you want to die, come and get it." He threw the soul spear in his hand at the attacking magical beast army and let out a furious roar. Ah! The spear pierced through countless magical beasts, but it was unable to stop the invasion of the magical beasts. To the tens of thousands of magical beasts, this amount of casualties was just a drop in the bucket. Many magical beasts continued to rush over. Although the 300 Spartans didn't have their spears, they still had their shields. The Spartans formed by the blue soul fire held their shields and ran in front of Leonidas, forming a rather thin shield barrier. However, their shields weren't the round shields in their hands, but their bodies. "Let's go, friends. Gather your souls here." When the 300 warriors formed a shield wall, Leonidas placed the spear in his right hand on the round shield in his left hand. Then, Leonidas slashed the round shield with the spear, and a flame suddenly ignited on the round shield. Leonidas then shouted the name of his relic. In an instant, countless flames appeared on Leonidas' round shield and spread all around, igniting the 300 warriors made of blue soul fire. In the next second, the 300 warriors made of blue soul fire instantly turned orange-red, and the warriors' figures gradually dissipated. Only the 300 shields emitting blazing hearts remained. Countless soul fires turned into red round shields, neatly arranged in the air, forming a shield formation, forming a true shield wall. The shields quickly moved to both sides, defending the entire north wall. The 300 shields became dots, and between the dots, there was an orange-red light film. The seemingly thin light film added an impenetrable layer of defense to the north wall. At this moment, countless demonic beasts had arrived in front of the north wall, or rather, the light film. They crashed into Leonidas's relic, using their teeth and claws, but no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't break through the defense of the shield wall. The people who saw this scene also recovered from their despair. They hadn't failed yet. With the help of the future heroes in human history, how could they fail? General Leonidas! The people guarding the north wall began to cheer for Leonidas, but at the same time, they didn't forget their duty. That was to guard the north wall as soldiers. One by one, the most powerful weapons for humans were activated, and the people were manually aiming at the demonic beast army, but they didn't dare to release the divine power seal. The soldiers were worried that releasing the divine power seal would destroy Leonidas's relic. Therefore, they could only watch in silence, clenching their fists, gritting their teeth, and blaming themselves for giving up just now. Leonidas, who turned back to look at this scene, smiled, because the soldiers had regained their fighting spirit. As long as the soldiers' despair and giving up were dispelled, Leonidas felt that this trip was worth it, even if he had to sacrifice himself in front of the demonic beast. However, in the next moment, something unexpected happened. Chapter 975. Jina Wang Lu Tan's second scenery. Suddenly, the voice of a young female general entered Leonidas' ears. Dan no yura aso tobi. In an instant, a few silhouettes flashed past the demonic beasts outside of Leonidas' noble phantasm. After a few flashes of light, a large amount of demonic beasts' blood splattered all over the place. The purple blood gushed out like a fountain and splashed onto Leonidas' noble phantasm's light barrier. This is General Nwakamaru? Leonida immediately recognized the owner of this technique and voice. It was the Tengu girl, Nwakamaru. However, not only Nwakamaru, but also Nwakamaru's warrior monk, who had been following Nwakamaru, also came here. Your Excellency Leonida, this humble monk and Master Nwakamaru have begun to move freely under King Gilgamesh's orders. It seems like this humble monk and Master Nwakamaru are not late. A man with many weapons on his back and Bicento in both hands, Musasobo Benkei, walked to Leonida's side from behind and stood upright with weapons in his hands. Oh! General Baiching, you're here too. Leonidas was deeply moved. As a comrade who had fought alongside him, the meticulous Leonidas naturally sensed the fear of death in Takashi Kei's heart. He did not expect that Kei would be able to come to the front lines. If it was the Musasobo Benkei who didn't go through the beheading operation, no one would think that Musasobo Benkei was a coward. However, after surviving the beheading operation, Musasobo Benkei could be said to have changed into a different person, or it could be said that he no longer suppressed the fear in his heart. After that, everyone could see that Musasobo Benkei was afraid of the battlefield and demonic beast. And of course, those who saw Musasobo Benkei's cowardice included Leonida. However, the cowardly Musasobo Benkei came to the front line with Nwakamaru. How could Leonida not be surprised? This humble monk is just a coward who carries the name of Musasobo Benkei. Since this humble monk carries the name of Musasobo Benkei, this humble monk will fulfill the duty of Musasobo Benkei and follow Master Nwakamaru at all times. Musasobo Benkei, or rather the Sea Lord who carried the name of Musasobo Benkei, said something that surprised Leonida's words. Leonida could tell that this soldier monk wasn't lying. He stared straight at Nwakamaru, who was flying up and down among the demonic beasts without the slightest hint of fear or cowardice. Ha! Looks like King Gilgamesh's decision to let you stay by General Nwakamaru's side is quite effective. Leonida laughed heartily. As a hero who left his name in human history, the soldier monk standing next to Leonidas, regardless of whether it was Bian Qing of Musashi or Hai Zun of Chonglu, as long as he was still a heroic spirit, he would definitely be able to overcome the fear in his heart. The only thing that would affect him was when he would wake up. Gilgamesh knew this very well, which was why he let Musasobo Benkei stay by Nwakamaru's side. Nwakamaru didn't disappoint and successfully pulled Musasobo Benkei back from the hell of cowardice. Ahem. General Leonida, we are still at war. Musasobo Benkei couldn't help but remind him. Leonida's laughter sounded like a party. Leonida's laughter wasn't soft. Not only did Musasobo Benkei hear it, but even Nwakamaru, who was fighting the demonic beasts outside the light barrier, heard it. Hey, General Leonida, this isn't the time to laugh, right? How long can your noble phantasm last? Nwakamaru, who was jumping around and killing the demonic beasts, One of the Nuwakamaru who was closest to Leonida couldn't help but complain. Then, he quickly asked about the matter at hand. Nyo-Rowan, who used the eightfold jump, used the demonic beasts as a springboard. The demonic beasts could not hurt Nyo-Rowan at all, but she could only create a few clones after using the eightfold jump. On the other hand, there were thousands of demonic beasts. She might not be able to kill them all even if she spent a day killing them. It was not a good idea to continue wasting time like this. Besides, it was also beneficial for them to know the duration of Leonidas' noble phantasm. I'm sorry, my noble phantasm can only last for a short period of time. It's reaching its limit soon. Just like what Leonida said, his noble phantasm could only last for a short period of time. The reason why Leonidas sacrificed himself to protect his allies at Hot Spring Gate was to give his comrades the opportunity to counterattack. Leonidas believed that they could do it and that they would be able to do it under his protection. His noble phantasm, the guardian of the Flame Gate, also appeared at Hot Spring Gate. However, it could only last for a short period of time. In addition, the demonic beasts were constantly attacking the light barrier. Even if Nuwakamaru started killing the demonic beasts, it was useless. This caused the duration of Leonida's noble phantasm to become shorter and shorter. Leonida originally wanted to revive the morale of his soldiers. He didn't even consider if he could survive this battle. It could be said that Leonida's mentality was exactly the same as Hot Spring Gate. He was already prepared to die. However, there was a difference between this and Hot Spring Gate. This time, there were reinforcements. My noble phantasm is about to disappear. You guys should take this opportunity to retreat. After Leonida finished speaking, his noble phantasm's light barrier began to dim as if it was reaching its limit. Although there were reinforcements, it was still useless against such a large number of demonic beasts. Once the light barrier was broken, they would fall into the demonic beasts with Leonida. What awaited them was only death. Leonida didn't want Nuwakamaru and Musasobo Benkei to die with him. That was why he wanted Nuwakamaru and Musasobo Benkei to retreat while he could still hold on. No, Mr. Leonida, we don't need to retreat. Musasobo Benkei said something that confused Leonida. Just as Leonidas was about to ask, something unexpected happened. Countless vines rose from the ground outside the north wall and attacked the demonic beasts' abdomens from below. The demonic beasts didn't even have time to scream before they were torn apart by the vines that were still growing. Whoa! A strange roar echoed throughout the north wall. This is... Leonida was shocked by the sudden appearance of the vines. But soon Leonida reacted. He had seen these vines before. They were the vines that blocked the demonic beasts for the incomplete north wall half a year ago. Although it had been half a year, Leonida still remembered it clearly. He couldn't be wrong. The one who did this must be mythical beast Funbaba? Chapter 976. When Leonidas said this name, the ground in the middle of the horde suddenly split open, and a huge green creature that looked like a bear or a deer emerged. This creature was Funbaba. Woo-woo! After Funbaba broke out of the ground, its body was not stained with the slightest bit of dirt. Its huge body stood in the middle of the horde like a crane in a flock of chickens. Leonidas didn't know what to say when he saw this scene. In short, his heart was filled with emotions. This poor monk and Nuwakamaru-sama passed by the abandoned Hyunryong shrine on our way here. At that time, Hyunryong-sama's Funbaba suddenly emerged from the Hyunryong shrine and came with us to the north wall. Musasobo Benkei, who was standing beside Leonidas, explained. It turned out that after Wuming left, Funbaba helped the humans build a wall made of vines and ran to the Hyunryong shrine to hibernate. Wuming didn't think that Funbaba would be able to hibernate in his shrine because there was nothing in the shrine that needed to be taken. In addition, Wuming also heard that the shrine was abandoned, so he didn't go there. This led to Wuming never meeting Funbaba. Although Wuming's shrine was cleaned by Siduri from time to time, because of the horde, Siduri didn't go there often. It could be said that for the past 6 months, she basically didn't go there. It could be said that it was abandoned. After Wuming used Yggdrasil, which was one with Funbaba, through the connection between the two, he accidentally woke up the sleeping Funbaba. Funbaba's arrival at this moment could be said to be a miracle for Leonidas because it gave him hope. This was the end of the Age of the Gods, a time when miracles still existed and mysteries had yet to completely disappear. Because of this, Leonidas did not repeat the mistakes of Hot Spring Gate. The reason why Funbaba didn't make a move before was because it needed time to construct a new vine barrier. Nawakamaru used his noble phantasm's remaining energy to display his amazing jumping ability. He jumped from the top of Leonidas' noble phantasm and landed steadily beside Leonidas and Musasobo Benkei. The vines that rose from the ground in front of the light continued to thicken and intertwine with each other. Just like Nawakamaru said, they gradually formed a vine barrier and protected the entire north wall. At this time, Leonidas' noble phantasm couldn't hold on any longer. The light barrier directly dimmed, and the orange-red shield that connected all the light barriers directly shattered. Leonidas staggered, but before Musasobo Benkei could help him, Leonidas used his spear to support himself and stood up straight again. "Are you okay, Your Excellency Leonidas?" Musasobo Benkei couldn't help but ask. The consumption of magic is a bit high. After all, Leonidas' noble phantasm protected the entire north wall, so the consumption of magic was naturally not small. "Since you can still move, then you should be able to kill monsters," Nawakamaru said as he used his thin green sword to pierce through the gaps of the vine barrier and kill the monsters that continuously attacked the vine barrier one by one. Although this was not the style of a general, at least he didn't have to worry about his life. It saved him time and energy, and he only needed to use his weapon to successfully stab the monsters. After all, this was war, and only victory was the foundation of everything. And with Funbaba's surprise attack, no matter how many magic beasts there were, their efforts would be futile. Due to the impact of Funbaba's appearance, countless monsters around were sent flying. Then, countless monsters swarmed towards Funbaba, who wasn't a monster, and prepared to tear this enemy apart. They were under the influence of Gorgon, and no longer had fear. Even if Funbaba was a mythical monster, they still dared to rush up and kill it. However, even after 2 rounds of strengthening, the monsters were still no match for Funbaba. The only advantage the monsters had was that they became fearless because of Gorgon's final command. If their opponent was a human, perhaps the monster's fearlessness would be extremely terrifying. Unfortunately, the monsters were facing a mythical monster, Funbaba. Woo-woo! Funbaba let out its unique roar while summoning vines from the ground to attack the monsters that approached it. The monsters couldn't get close to Funbaba at all. When they got close, they were either pierced by the vines or crushed by the vines. Countless monsters' blood splashed on the ground, but because of the distance, there wasn't a trace of purple blood within a few meters of Funbaba. It looked like it was handling the situation with ease. At this moment, Funbaba's hind legs were bent, its butt was on the ground, and it was using its forelimbs to support its body. It looked like Funbaba was quite noble. As more and more monsters were killed by Funbaba, Musu Maf, as the monster commander, made his move. The originally stable ground under Funbaba's feet suddenly bulged. Funbaba jumped to avoid the 7 snake heads that were trying to attack it. The vines paved the way for Funbaba. Funbaba wasn't stained by the blood on the ground at all. Changed to another place and used the vines to clean up all the monsters there. Funbaba once again sat down nobly and continued to clean up the monsters. Musu Maf, who broke out from the ground where Funbaba was originally sitting, didn't leave the ground and wasn't in a hurry to attack Funbaba. Instead, it slowly retracted the 7 snake heads back into the ground and hid again. Although Musu Maf was affected by Gorgon, It was different from the mass-produced monsters. It didn't fall into a fanatical state where it didn't fear death. In other words, it could still use its brain. This could be seen from the fact that Musu Maf wanted to attack Funbaba from the ground. However, Funbaba was unmoved. It was just a mere Musu Maf, who was lucky enough to avoid its vines underground. It was simply not enough to be mentioned in the same breath as Funbaba. It must be known that Funbaba was comparable to the heavenly bull Gugalana. Even if it was facing the real Tiamat, the real Funbaba could contend against it, let alone a mere Musu Maf. In Funbaba's view, at the very least, it should let Gorgon, who had Tiamat's authority, be its opponent. Just as Funbaba thought, Musu Maf, who had sneaked into the ground to prepare another sneak attack, was found and entangled by the vines that Funbaba had arranged underground. The struggling Musu Maf drilled out from the ground. There were several injuries on its body. It seemed that it had suffered a big loss from Funbaba. At this time, Gorgon couldn't stand it anymore. Monsters, attack the north wall. Chapter 977. Gorgon ordered again. She told the magical beasts to ignore Funbaba and attack the north wall. Funbaba was just a clown to her. The only thing that mattered was to break through the north wall. Roar! The magical beasts chose to ignore Funbaba. After roaring a few times, they all rushed toward the vine barrier created by Funbaba. Even though Funbaba was still killing the magical beasts, it still couldn't stop the magical beasts from attacking the vine barrier. The vine barrier was disappearing at a speed visible to the naked eye. This made Leonidas, Nawakamaru, and Mizusobo Benkei, who were killing the magical beasts from the gaps in the vine barrier, quite nervous. "Damn it, we can't kill them all!" Nawakamaru couldn't help but blurt out in annoyance. After all, there were too many magical beasts. Even if Funbaba could create vines, it wouldn't be able to kill all of them in a short time. Funbaba had been preparing for the vine barrier for a short period of time. If it wanted to create enough vines to kill so many magical beasts, it would take a while for it to prepare. At the moment, whether it was Nawakamaru, Leonidas, or Mizusobo Benkei, they didn't have a good way to deal with the current situation. Since the vine barrier can't stop the magical beasts, we can only change the method. Leonidas suddenly said. Then, he looked at Nawakamaru. "General Nawakamaru, I have a request." Leonidas said something to Nawakamaru. Nawakamaru was stunned for a moment. Even Mizusobo Benkei was stunned for a moment. It seems this poor monk was too focused on the battlefield. I actually forgot about this matter. Mizusobo Benkei shook his head in self-mockery. But the situation was urgent, so it wasn't the time to chat. "Then, I'll go." After Nyo Rowan finished speaking, he immediately ran towards the north wall, as if he was flying. Only Nyo Rowan and Leonidas were left to continue slaughtering the magical beasts. As for Funbaba, while Funbaba was hesitating, the sound of chains could be heard. A large number of silver-white chains bound Funbaba's body, preventing it from slaughtering the magical beasts. "Walala!" Funbaba looked up. It was Enkidu. No, it was the fake Enkidu. Funbaba had seen this guy before, so he wasn't unfamiliar with him. Funbaba just didn't know who the other party was. "Just a mere beast, behave yourself." Kingu's expression was cold, and the heaven lock that emerged from the ripples around him tightened its grip on Funbaba. However, Funbaba wasn't a god. The heaven lock was just a very strong chain to it. It could easily break free with brute force or skill, such as now. New vines appeared on the ground around Funbaba. These vines didn't attack the magical beasts that were passing by. Instead, they stretched between the heaven lock and Funbaba, slowly expanding the heaven lock that bound Funbaba. Funbaba easily jumped out of it. Walala! After Funbaba broke free, Kingu subconsciously released the heaven lock. The heaven lock turned into golden light and dissipated with the sound of chains. Sure enough, the heaven lock doesn't have much effect on a beast like you. Kingu wasn't surprised by this result. Whether it was himself or Funbaba, he knew that if they really fought, he might not be able to subdue this mythical beast that was stronger than a bull. It was also because of this self-awareness that Kingu's task wasn't to kill or trap Funbaba. His task was only to distract Funbaba and provide cover for others. Rumble, the ground under Funbaba's feet suddenly shattered. A large amount of land fell into a pitch-black abyss, and the area was so large that almost 1/6 of the magical beasts suffered this disaster. Funbaba stepped on the vines that grew out of the ground that hadn't completely collapsed, trying to use them as stepping stones to escape. However, a huge snake tail that was about the same size as Funbaba suddenly stretched out and pulled Funbaba into the ground. If someone paid attention to Gorgon, they would find that Gorgon had disappeared at some point. It was obvious that the collapse of the ground was caused by Gorgon. Ignoring the large-scale collapse of the ground, Kingu knew that Funbaba had been dragged into the ground by Gorgon, and Kingu was providing cover for Gorgon. Funbaba was comparable to a bull, and only Gorgon could defeat it. However, Kingu didn't expect that Gorgon would choose to drag Funbaba into the ground. This wasn't a good thing. After all, other than Gorgon, there was another big enemy that was about to arrive. Silver Meteor! Following the release of a powerful noble phantasm, a bright white beam of light with a hint of gold instantly shot from one end of the vine barrier to the other end of the vine barrier in front of the north wall. All the magical beasts that were within a few dozen meters of the vine barrier were all enveloped by this beam of light. Obviously, these magical beasts were as dead as they could be. After all, this was the so-called light cannon. How could the mass-produced magical beasts withstand it? Jingu dared to conclude that this light cannon must have killed more than half of the magical beasts. In addition to the magical beasts that had fallen into the abyss after being attacked indiscriminately by Gorgon, the remaining magical beasts could be said to be the only ones left, who asked the magical beasts to listen to Gorgon's orders and collectively attack the vine barrier. Their gathering together was advantageous for the other party to release his noble phantasm. Among the magical beasts that were affected, only one of the magical beasts' commanders, Musu Mafu, survived. Even so, 5 of its heads were broken. One of the remaining 2 heads drooped down and was basically dead. The other head, which was the last one, was also bleeding profusely. It seemed like Musu Mafu didn't have the ability to regenerate its snake heads like Gorgon did. Otherwise, it would have been suppressed. I didn't expect that man to have such a powerful anti-city noble phantasm. Kingu was naturally referring to Wuming, but Kingu was wrong. Normally, light cannons were considered anti-city noble phantasms unless they had special effect. However, Wuming's noble phantasm, Silver Meteor, was an anti-evil noble phantasm that he obtained from the suppression force. It wasn't an anti-city noble phantasm. Silver Meteor was only released in the form of a light cannon. Magical beasts could be said to be evil to humans, so naturally, they were also evil to Wuming, who was the guardian of humans. However, even if the other party wasn't evil, with the characteristics of Wuming's noble phantasm, he could forcefully add an evil attribute to the magical beast. It was just that the magical beasts themselves didn't require Wuming to do so. However, Wuming still felt that this was too much of a coincidence. Chapter 978. This was also the reason why one of the surviving demonic beast commanders, Musu Mafu, was in such a miserable state. If it weren't for the fact that there were too many demonic beasts, which helped Musu Mafu block a portion of the attack, Wuming's attack could have easily killed Musu Mafu. Silently shaking his head, Kingu wanted to give up on these demonic beasts. Anyway, his mother and the new humans were not harmed. As long as his mother came out, this world would be over. No one could stop his mother. Even that man, in Kingu's opinion, could not stop his mother from destroying Mesopotamia and cleansing the human race. After thinking about this, Kingu focused his eyes and looked in Wuming's direction. His mother was a great enemy, so he had to pay attention to her movements. Moreover, he was so far away, so he shouldn't be affected. With Enkidu's powerful eyesight, Kingu easily saw Wuming in the distance, who was holding a broken lightsaber. Ugh! This made Kingu feel a headache again, and he couldn't help but groan. This made Kingu shocked. He was shocked because he still couldn't get used to facing that man, and the situation seemed to be getting worse. At this moment, Gorgon had run underground. This was really bad. In the distance, Wuming removed Meteor Silver's noble phantasm liberation and gathered the broken lightsaber in his right hand, turning the broken lightsaber back into a bright silver knight's sword. After Wuming killed Bashumu and used the divine blade of salvation to clean up the poison in the surroundings, he must have rushed over from the north wall without stopping. However, because Wuming had already sensed Funbaba's aura at the north wall, he was not in a hurry. Therefore, Wuming hid himself and went around to the inconspicuous edge of the north wall, ready to act according to the situation. After all, no matter when, the enemy is in the open while I'm in the dark, was quite advantageous. Coincidentally, Gorgon made the demonic beasts ignore Funbaba and attack the vine barrier instead. This gave Wuming an opportunity. When the demonic beasts rushed up to attack the vine barrier, Wuming directly took out the meteor silver that had accompanied him for a long time and directly released its evil noble phantasm, successfully killing most of the demonic beasts. The reason why Wuming did not use the divine blade of salvation was entirely because in the current situation, meteor silver was more useful than the divine blade of salvation, and also because it had been a long time since Wuming had meteor silver. Although it was a noble phantasm's noble phantasm, it was a noble phantasm had accompanied Wuming was a noble phantasm of salvation. Wuming opened the dragon lair and put away the meteor silver. Then, he raised himself up and took in the entire north wall. After being affected by Gorgon's attack and being blasted down by Wuming's light cannon, the demons attacking the northern wall were almost completely wiped out. At most, there was only a sixth of their original numbers left, and a half-crippled demonic commander. However, even if there were only these demonic beasts left, the number of demonic beasts was still considerable, at least to the humans. However, Wuming had already helped them a lot, and it was impossible for him to continue helping them. After all, if the humans were to completely rely on God, Gilgamesh's will of separation between man and God would probably die directly. Therefore, the remaining demonic beasts could only be eliminated by the humans themselves. In addition, Wuming had a more important point. Wuming saw the fake Enkidu that seemed to be Kingu. Wuming had a feeling that the other party must be an extraordinary existence in this singularity. Perhaps the other party was hiding some secrets that Wuming did not know about, such as Tiamat. Wuming immediately flew towards Enkidu. When Enkidu noticed Wuming coming over, he immediately dived into the bottomless abyss that was opened up by Gorgon. Wuming stopped above the bottomless abyss, then glanced at Leonidas and Misasobo Benkei, who were protected by vines. After nodding to the two of them, Wuming did not hesitate and dived into the abyss. "Let's go, Mr. Bianqing. This place will be broken soon. We should retreat." The vine barrier was consumed by the previous magical beast. It was estimated that it would not last long. If they continued to stay, then they would be swallowed up by the remaining magical beasts. As they understood before, even if the number of magical beasts was consumed, the number of magical beasts would still pose a threat to humans. However, they could rely on the north wall to deal with the current number of beasts. Silent understood this point. That's why he gave Leonidas the task of dealing with the beasts outside the north wall. That's why he nodded to Leonidas earlier. Leonidas and Misasobo Benkei saw that sporadic magical beasts had entered through the gap in the vine barrier. They immediately returned to the north wall. Wuming couldn't help but frown as he went deeper into the abyss created by Gorgon's destruction. He had not reached the bottom yet. Did Gorgon directly penetrate the underworld when he destroyed the underground? Wuming couldn't help but ask. It wasn't Wuming's fault. After all, the deeper they went, the colder it got. The surrounding rocks gradually became similar to the underworld. But if that was the case, then Wuming had doubts. Why did Ereshkigal move the underworld here? There weren't many underworld that followed Ereshkigal to the Mesopotamia. Most of the land was centered around Kuza city. Although Ereshkigal could move the underworld, but there was no need to move the underworld outside the north wall. It was too strange. The deeper Wuming went, the more he felt that this was indeed the underworld. Because he saw the spear cages inserted into the ground. There were still sporadic Garrula's spirits. It's a little troublesome. Although Wuming guessed that Ereshkigal was on the side of the humans, but she used the same method as the Quetzalcoatl to cause her to stand on the opposite side of the humans. But, for now, Ereshkigal was still a member of the Three Goddesses Alliance. Gorgon and Funbaba broke in, plus Kingu who escaped Wuming into the underworld, and Wuming who chased after Kingu. With so many extraordinary beings breaking into the underworld, Ereshkigal was bound to be dissatisfied. These beings who entered the underworld could be regarded as Ereshkigal's enemies. Even if Ereshkigal's temper was good, she was still the queen who controlled the underworld. More importantly, Gorgon brought people to attack the underworld. Ereshkigal might be angry because of this. Just like now. Boom! Chapter 979. The violent tremors shook the entire underworld. It was as if the Lord of the Underworld was enraged. And this angry Lord of the Underworld could only be Ereshkigal. Sure enough, she's angry. Wuming couldn't help but nod. He was right. It was like a person who liked to live alone. If several uninvited guests suddenly broke into this person's house, and they were the kind that fought, if Wuming was that person, Wuming would definitely be angry. And once a master who had almost perfect absolute power in the home got angry, the consequences were really unimaginable. It was fine if something happened to Gorgon because of Ereshkigal's anger. After all, he was an enemy. Wuming's main concern was Funbaba. Funbaba was like a pet to Wuming and also like a partner. The Funbaba that had fused with Yggdrasil was also Wuming's weapon. No matter what, Wuming could not let anything happen to Funbaba. With this thought in mind, Wuming sped up a little. After a while, Wuming finally left the long passage and really came to the underworld. Then, he landed on a broken stone pillar. Wuming looked at the dim underworld. It was still the same realm filled with stone pillars and stone bridges, and it gave people a feeling that it was endless. And such a common scene would make people feel despair and death. The underworld is really full of death everywhere. Wuming couldn't help but sigh. This was the second time Wuming came to the underworld, but Wuming could only say simple and specific words like desolation and death in Wuming's evaluation. After all, no matter who it was, when they saw a world that looked like it was dead, they would have such a feeling. Moreover, because the underworld had not seen the sun all year round, no, it should be because there was no sun since ancient times, countless death aura filled the entire underworld. If an ordinary living person entered the underworld by mistake, he would probably die in a few minutes. Even Gadotsi, who was equipped with the new magic dress invented by Da Vinci, would not last long. In a sense, preventing living creatures from entering the underworld could be regarded as saving others' lives in disguise. Although there were no living creatures in the underworld, there were many moving objects, such as the Garrula spirit, the Soul Reaper. Of course, there were also some resentful spirits that had left the spear cage and walked in the underworld because of the disrepair of the spear cage. Moreover, the land of the underworld also had no other landscape except for stones. In the absence of animals, it was even more impossible for plants to exist in the underworld. To be honest, the underworld that did not even have a single flower was a little pitiful. In short, Ereshkigal's spear cage, inserted into the ground, could be regarded as a unique landscape in the underworld. However, Wuming did not have time to appreciate these landscapes. It was more important to get down to business. Wuming flew quickly toward a place below where the concentration of magic power was obviously different from other places. After crossing a large number of stone bridges, climbing over countless stone pillars, and passing by a few stone platforms, Wuming even bypassed a huge stone pillar that could be called a mountain. Finally, Wuming arrived at his destination. Wuming vaguely saw the figure of Funbaba on Gorgon. Not only that, but Wuming also vaguely saw the phantom of a huge garrulous spirit. It seemed to be Ereshkigal. However, because of the death aura in the underworld, it had the effect of interfering with Wuming's vision, making Wuming unable to see clearly. But since he could not see clearly, he would take a closer look. He sped up and broke through the death aura of the underworld. The scene in the deepest part of the underworld was reflected in Wuming's eyes. Then, Wuming could not help but be shocked. This was an extremely desolate and empty sight without the slightest building. There was only desolation and vastness. However, this desolation made this sight seem wider. However, this place was indeed larger than any platform Wuming had seen on the road. It was not a visual error, but Wuming's true judgment. Whether it was Gorgon, Funbaba, or the huge garrulous spirit transformed by Ereshkigal, the three were not small, but when they were in this desolate open space at this moment, they did not seem crowded at all. On the contrary, they seemed quite small. However, Wuming was not surprised by this, but the situation at the scene. Funbaba was lying on the side obediently, which made Wuming breathe a sigh of relief. The huge garrulous spirit transformed by Ereshkigal stabbed the light spear in her hand into the ground. Her body was still trembling slightly, and she seemed to be struggling. As for Gorgon, he was the one that surprised Wuming the most. The black mud completely covered Gorgon's body. The black mud, which could be considered a liquid, was constantly flowing on Gorgon's body, giving people the feeling that it was a lump of black mud in the shape of Gorgon that could flow on its own. However, Wuming was sure that this was Gorgon. Not to mention Gorgon's huge body, Funbaba entered the underworld with Gorgon. What's more, as the lord of the underworld, Ereshkigal was personally present. This lump of black mud was definitely Gorgon. However, how did Gorgon become like this? Wuming was used to Gorgon's changes due to the black mud from time to time, but the change this time was really not trivial. Those who did not know would think that this was really a lump of black mud. Not only that, but Gorgon was also surrounded by huge stones, and the black mud on Gorgon's body seemed to be restricted, unable to flow out of the circle formed by these stones. At that moment, Wuming saw what was going on. Gorgon should have been restricted by Ereshkigal using the authority of the underworld, but judging from Ereshkigal's situation, she seemed to be struggling quite a bit. Perhaps the restriction on Gorgon would not last long, and Funbaba should know that it could not help much, so it lay on the side and rested. However, just as Wuming was thinking, Funbaba, who discovered Wuming, immediately got up and ran over. Woo woo woo. Funbaba directly rubbed its big green fur face against Wuming, and it also made a cheerful cry. This could be said to be the first time Funbaba and Wuming officially met after being separated for so long. Although it was in the underworld, Funbaba was still very happy. Now that Funbaba discovered Wuming, Ereshkigal naturally also discovered the existence of Wuming. Xian. Hyunryong. Ereshkigal's huge garrulous spirit couldn't help but cry out. If only listening to the voice, it was somewhat similar to Ishtar's voice, and more importantly, this voice was full of panic, which made people feel that it was quite cute. However, Wuming, who heard this voice, was directly stunned. What's with Ereshkigal's girlish voice? Chapter 980. Ereshkigal? Wuming asked doubtfully, and he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows. Any intellectual existence could see that Wuming was very confused at the moment. Funbaba was like this, and Ereshkigal was even more so. However, this was something that couldn't be helped. Wuming had only seen Ereshkigal once. It was when he met Ereshkigal in the underworld near Abif Mountain. At that time, Ereshkigal's voice sounded full of majesty. It was completely in line with the titles of the Mistress of the Underworld and the Queen of the Garrulous Spirit. But the voice that Ereshkigal made just now could be said to be completely different from the voice that Ereshkigal made before. It was like two different people. If Wuming wasn't sure that the other party was indeed Ereshkigal, Wuming suspected that Ereshkigal was disguised by Ishtar. After all, Ereshkigal's voice was too similar to Ishtar's. Ahem. Sure enough, you also came to my underworld, Hyun Ryong. After hearing Wuming's questioning voice, Ereshkigal immediately adjusted her voice and returned to the previous queen-like way of speaking. Seeing that Ereshkigal changed her voice, Wuming didn't pursue this matter anymore. After all, Funbaba is my partner, and Gorgon is my enemy. I have to come over. As Wuming said, Funbaba rubbed against Wuming again. However, Ereshkigal sneered at this, but not at the relationship between Funbaba and Wuming, but at the uninvited provocation of Wuming and the others. You know, this is my underworld. You can't come in casually, whether it's a human or a god. The last time I let you and the goddess of greed leave was entirely because of your special identity, but this doesn't mean that you can come in my underworld whenever you want. In the blink of an eye, a large amount of mana was released from the garrulous spirit's body, forming a shockwave that caused the surrounding temperature to drop even lower. Ereshkigal's demeanor as the mistress of the underworld could be said to be vividly displayed. However, Wuming didn't care and even wanted to laugh. However, this made Ereshkigal feel that Wuming was insulting her, so she became even angrier. The temperature of the underworld dropped again, and a layer of frost rose on Funbaba's hair. Wuming even felt a trace of coldness. This made Wuming look at Ereshkigal in a new light. But at the same time, Wuming's smile became more intense. However, Wuming's smile was not because of Wuming's arrogance. Wuming was full of smiles because of Ereshkigal. You'd better save some magic power to deal with Gorgon. As soon as Wuming said this, the huge garrulous spirit transformed by Ereshkigal couldn't help but tremble. Ereshkigal understood what Wuming meant. He instantly saw her current difficulty. Restraining Gorgon, who was completely stained with black mud at this moment, already made Ereshkigal suffer. For the sake of her face, she diverted some magic power to deal with Wuming. This was a huge burden for Ereshkigal. Adding hail to snow was light. Therefore, Wuming's smile was not mocking Ereshkigal for being half-hearted at this time. Wuming just felt that Ereshkigal was a little like Ishtar. For a long time, Ishtar had made humans worry a lot, but it was only to the extent of worry. Humans did not have hatred for Ishtar. In other words, Ishtar was not an evil god. At best, she was just a good god who kept doing evil. As mentioned before, Ishtar was the mistress of the sky and the most beloved daughter of the gods. Even if there were some reasons that caused Ishtar to start doing evil, those evil were still some evil that was not serious. For example, in the myths, Dumas and Nelgal were tricked by Ishtar into the underworld and paid a certain price. But overall, the two were gods, so the price was nothing. Even if it was more extreme, they could be resurrected after death. Also, Ishtar was humiliated by Gilgamesh and released the Bull of Heaven to wreak havoc on the earth for 7 years, causing the humans in Mesopotamia to have no harvest. But Ishtar only let the Bull of Heaven to wreak havoc on the earth, and did not let it kill humans. It could be said that as the mistress of the sky, Ishtar was completely a barbaric princess who often indulged herself but had a certain level of propriety. Although Ishtar's propriety was very low, in short, in Wuming's view, as a god who was the same divinity as Ishtar, but with a different side of divinity, Ereshkigal was not that bad. Ereshkigal's position in the myths was an evil god. She was the ruler of death and corruption, the queen of the underworld who ruled over the underworld. She was an evil god who was feared by humans. Before he met Ereshkigal, Wuming originally thought that Ereshkigal was an evil god who was described by the world. But after their last encounter, Wuming discovered that Ereshkigal actually loved humans very much. She was just prepared to use methods that the world could not accept to save humans, just like the feathered serpent god. And Ereshkigal's panicked voice to Wuming just now exposed some information about Ereshkigal, such as her sternness was fake. Ereshkigal was probably different from how she appeared and the myths that the world spread. Wuming felt that Ereshkigal was probably a goddess who was very easy to talk to. Ereshkigal and Ishtar were different sides of the same divinity. Ishtar was the mistress of the sky, a goddess who was in charge of harvest, a goddess who represented life, while Ereshkigal was the mistress of the underworld, a goddess who was in charge of corruption and death, a power that was undoubtedly feared. The powers of the two were opposite to each other to a certain extent. Since that was the case, their personalities might also be opposite. For example, Ishtar was the opposite of not easy to talk to at all and very arrogant, but Ereshkigal became very easy to talk to and kind to people. Wuming guessed that the world's fear of Ereshkigal was probably only because Ereshkigal was in charge of death, and Ereshkigal did not defend herself. Therefore, the human understanding of Ereshkigal stopped at a terrifying goddess. But because of this, Ereshkigal, who pretended to be cold and acted like a child in order to maintain the image that the world described, how could Wuming not feel gratified, amused, and laughed? Chapter 981. However, just 2 meetings could not prove anything at all. After all, these were just Wuming's guesses. Although they were close to the correct answer, guesses were still guesses. Before obtaining real information and hearing the truth from Ereshkigal, Wuming would not make a judgment easily. At that moment, Wuming no longer thought about this. Instead, he turned to pay attention to Gorgon. After all, Gorgon was quite attractive at the moment, but this attractive referred to the dangerous aspect. To understand Gorgon's situation, asking the person involved, Ereshkigal, was the most direct and effective way. Therefore, Wuming spoke directly. Ereshkigal, before I arrived, what happened to Gorgon? If he wanted to deal with Gorgon, he had to know what happened to him to become like this. If he was not careful, the root of the black mud was likely to flow into the underworld. At this moment, Gorgon was already an accident, and Wuming did not want another accident to happen. The giant garrulous spirit transformed by Ereshkigal glanced at Wuming. Although its huge skeletal eyes did not have eyeballs, Wuming could feel that Ereshkigal was indeed glaring at him, as if to say, "You are really rude." However, Ereshkigal finally told Wuming the truth. The battle between Gorgon and Funbaba disturbed the garrulous spirit and affected the peace of the underworld. However, because of the suppression of the underworld, the two were only fighting with brute force, and it did not cause much damage to the underworld. After all, the underworld suppressed divinity. Although Funbaba did not have divinity, it was not a living thing, in a sense after fusing with Yggdrasil, so it would also be suppressed to a certain extent. However, the size of the two was there, and it did not matter if their abilities were suppressed. The result was just as Ereshkigal said, it became a situation of fighting with brute force. After that, I showed up and used the authority of the underworld to suppress Funbaba and Gorgon. Even if the three goddesses' alliance was a cooperative relationship on the surface, it was a fact that Gorgon broke into Ereshkigal's territory and started a fight. However, because he did not attack Ereshkigal, Gorgon was not punished by the three goddesses' alliance. On the other hand, Ereshkigal used the authority of the underworld to suppress Ereshkigal and did not cause any harm to her. In addition, it was indeed Gorgon who broke into the territory of the other goddesses, so the alliance did not punish Ereshkigal. In this contradictory situation where both sides made mistakes and neither side was wrong, simply put, Gorgon would be suppressed in the underworld, but Ereshkigal could not hurt Gorgon. But for some reason, Gorgon showed signs of resisting the suppression of the underworld. It should be known that any god who entered the underworld would be suppressed, and Ereshkigal was a god who was born to manage the underworld. She was even given the authority to be invincible in the underworld. Therefore, the active suppression personally implemented by Ereshkigal was more absolute than the passive suppression of non-living beings by the underworld. According to what Ereshkigal said, Gorgon and Funbaba fought with brute force. It could be seen that the suppression of the underworld was indeed effective on Gorgon. However, the passive suppression of the underworld was effective on Gorgon, and the active and stronger suppression personally implemented by Ereshkigal on Gorgon was actually resisted by Gorgon? Most importantly, the agreement of the three goddesses' alliance was still in place, so how could Gorgon have the ability to resist? Hearing Ereshkigal's words, Wuming could not help but look at the origin black soil that completely covered Gorgon. The only existence that could make Gorgon resist Ereshkigal's authority was the origin black soil. After that, a lot of black matter emerged from Gorgon's body. Not only did it completely envelop Gorgon, but it also directly broke my suppression on Gorgon. Ereshkigal, who said this, had a hint of panic, like a little girl who was pretending to be strong and was about to cry when she encountered an unsolvable problem. Ereshkigal's instantaneous breaking of the suppression made Wuming look at Ereshkigal in shock again. Moreover, this also made Wuming feel that his previous guess was right. However, the huge skeletal face of Ereshkigal, which was transformed into the giant Garrula spirit, did not show any emotion at all. And Ereshkigal probably also realized that she had broken the suppression again, so she quickly adjusted her tone and changed the topic. Ahem. The reason why I can suppress Gorgon now is because I obtained the result at the cost of my divinity, but the effect is still quite forceful. Wuming could not help but be stunned. It turned out that Ereshkigal had used her own divinity as the price to barely suppress Gorgon, and Ereshkigal, who was constantly consuming her divinity, would definitely not be able to hold on for long. This was the reason why Ereshkigal looked like she was struggling. No matter how stupid Ereshkigal was, she could see that this black mud was not something good. If this stuff flowed into the underworld, not to mention the harm it would cause, just cleaning it up would make Ereshkigal vexed for a while. The black mud is extremely corrosive. Inanimate objects are basically unaffected, but living objects might be an exception. If you allow the black mud to flow into the underworld, you'd better be prepared to give up on the underworld. Wuming's inanimate objects and living objects naturally referred to inanimate objects and living objects in a broad sense. For example, inanimate objects were the underworld, and living objects were the Garrula spirit. Wuming guessed that the black mud, which came from the same source as him, should also have the ability to ignore rules. It was precisely this ability that made Ereshkigal's suppression ineffective against Gorgon. Even if it could not compare to Wuming's ability to ignore the rules of the underworld, it was still very likely that Gorgon, who was engulfed by the black mud, could ignore the rules of the underworld of a world. However, Wuming's words gave Ereshkigal a fright. Huh! Is this thing so terrifying? But come to think of it, this thing attached to Gorgon allowed Gorgon to easily break through Ereshkigal's suppression. In the end, Ereshkigal had to pay the price of divinity to suppress Gorgon. Ereshkigal could naturally see that the black mud was different, but she did not expect Wuming to say such serious words. Therefore, Ereshkigal became a little dissatisfied. What do you mean by that? Chapter 982. To be honest, Wuming's words made Ereshkigal a little unhappy. What did he mean by giving up the underworld? As the mistress of the underworld, Ereshkigal seemed to have unlimited power. She held the authority of the underworld and could be said to be an invincible existence in the underworld. However, the disadvantage was quite obvious. Ereshkigal could not leave the underworld. It was not that Ereshkigal was unwilling to leave the underworld. She had no choice. As the cornerstone of the underworld's birth, Ereshkigal used the condition of not being able to leave the underworld in exchange for the effect of being invincible in the underworld. Because it was not Ereshkigal's initiative, it was comparable to a curse. The underworld had only stones and the garrulous spirit. It was also dark all year round. No matter what, Ereshkigal was a girl. How could she be willing to stay here? It was only for the sake of responsibility. However, this was not the main point. The main point was that Ereshkigal and the underworld were closely related. It was not an exaggeration to say that the two had a symbiotic relationship. However, Wuming asked her to give up the underworld. What was the difference between that and asking her to die? In this regard, Wuming explained. It's just an if. Don't be nervous. I won't let things develop to the point where the master of the underworld has no choice but to give up the underworld, Wuming said confidently. Wuming did not want to let Gorgon leave the underworld alive today. As Wuming spoke, he took out the divine blade of salvation from the golden ripples and flew toward Gorgon's huge body that was engulfed by the black mud. Did he really come down just to find the Funbaba? Did he have no intention of getting rid of Gorgon? The answer was, of course, that he did. Due to the backlash from Tiamat's authority and the origin black soil, Gorgon's entire god had become somewhat abnormal. If Wuming had to make an analogy, it would be that Gorgon had transformed from an avenger to a madman. If he continued to let Gorgon run free, something could happen to him. Furthermore, the magical beast army had mobilized in full force. Taking this opportunity to annihilate the enemy was the best course of action. How long can you suppress Gorgon? Wuming suddenly asked Ereshkigal. Ereshkigal didn't react for a moment. Can you suppress Gorgon, who might go berserk because of the threat of death? Ahem. Hyunryong, your self-righteous attitude is really annoying. Ereshkigal cleared her throat and unhappily replied to Wuming. Please answer truthfully. This is related to the following plan, as well as the situation of you and the underworld. At this moment Wuming was like a god. His expression was rather serious, and his tone was filled with an undeniable charm. Perhaps Wuming didn't mean this, but only the strong could decide everything. Wuming had a way to get rid of Gorgon. Since that was the case, he had to be stronger than Ereshkigal. Probably due to Ereshkigal's natural mischief, she didn't realize that the atmosphere between her and Wuming had gradually become one of a superior and subordinate. She only decided that Wuming had suddenly become much more serious. Wuming's sudden seriousness made Ereshkigal a little overwhelmed. It was just like how Ishtar faced Wuming. However, compared to Ishtar's grievance toward Wuming, Ereshkigal felt more uneasy toward Wuming. At that moment, Ereshkigal also subconsciously ignored the fact that she continued to dress up as the goddess of fear and directly communicated with Wuming in her original voice. If I suppress her like this, I can suppress her until my divinity completely disappears. The pure girl's voice came from the huge garrulous spirit. It was slightly out of place, but Wuming's attention was no longer on this. He was paying attention to Ereshkigal's answer. The first half of the sentence made Wuming quite satisfied, but the second half of Ereshkigal's answer made Wuming stunned. As for whether I can suppress Gorgon, who went berserk due to the threat of death, I don't know, Ereshkigal answered Wuming rather weakly. Probably because of her lack of confidence, Ereshkigal's last few words were pitifully soft. Fortunately, Wuming's hearing was good. However, Wuming hoped that he heard wrong. What do you mean you don't know? Wuming frowned. Ereshkigal's answer was related to the survival of the underworld. She gave Wuming an ambiguous answer like, I don't know. How could Wuming deal with Gorgon next? Wuming was going to stab Gorgon's heart with the divine blade of salvation and use the power of the source in the divine blade of salvation to kill Gorgon as the core. In this way, these source black mud without a core were equivalent to lambs waiting to be slaughtered by Wuming. For the current Wuming to deal with the ownerless source black mud, Wuming expressed that it was a piece of cake. However, that was based on the assumption that Gorgon would not break Ereshkigal's suppression due to the threat of death. Although Wuming could still kill Gorgon, if Gorgon, as the source of the source black mud, broke through Ereshkigal's suppression and allowed the black mud to flow into the underworld, it would be quite troublesome to deal with the aftermath. In the event of an accident, Ereshkigal, who could not leave the underworld, might become the core of the next source black mud. Although Wuming and Ereshkigal had only met twice, Wuming had a good impression of Ereshkigal. Wuming did not want Ereshkigal to become his enemy. Of course, even if the source black mud flowed into the underworld after Gorgon broke through Ereshkigal's suppression, Wuming had a way to get rid of the source black mud. However, in that case the underworld would probably be affected as well. In the best case it would be half destroyed, and in the worst case it would cease to exist. After all, there were not many underworlds that followed Ereshkigal back to the Mesopotamia. If Wuming carried out the cleansing indiscriminately, the underworld that returned with Ereshkigal would probably disappear. In that case, Ereshkigal would probably also leave. The curse of only being able to stay in the underworld was no joke. Without the underworld, Ereshkigal would undoubtedly leave. Wuming did not want to kill the enemy by sacrificing people who might become allies. What was the difference between that and killing the criminal along with the hostage? If that was the case, Wuming might as well let the black mud enter the underworld and erode Ereshkigal. Anyway, the result would be that Ereshkigal would leave because of Wuming. It would be the same no matter which side it was. Therefore, Wuming asked Ereshkigal if she could suppress Gorgon, who might go berserk. Wuming wanted to use the method with the least loss. After all, the three goddesses' alliance was the enemy of mankind. Gilgamesh would probably happily say something like, "Isn't it great to take this opportunity to destroy the two pillars of the three goddesses' alliance?" However, since Wuming saw that Ereshkigal did indeed have another hidden side, Wuming would not do that. Chapter 983. Ereshkigal was obviously hiding something. Since Wuming did not kill the feathered serpent god when he captured her, and instead chose to rope her in after learning about her secrets, then Wuming would not attack Ereshkigal either. Wuming would make a decision after fully understanding Ereshkigal's situation. If Ereshkigal was really hiding something, then Wuming would try his best to rope in Ereshkigal. If Ereshkigal was just an evil god, then Wuming could punish her later. To put it simply, Wuming actually wanted to see a so-called happy ending. From this point of view, it was not surprising that Wuming and Merlin could become friends. I definitely know that these black things are up to no good, but they are Gorgon. She is a member of the Three Goddesses Alliance, just like me. Even if I can use my divinity to suppress Gorgon, there is no way I can suppress Gorgon, who went berserk because of the threat of death. Ereshkigal refuted Wuming, feeling wronged. It was not that Ereshkigal did not know what was good for her. At this point, how could Ereshkigal not realize the seriousness of the problem? Just from the moment she had to use her divinity to suppress Gorgon, Ereshkigal realized that the problem was probably very serious. It was just that the person who made Ereshkigal realize this was the person who made it clear to her was Wuming. But she really could not do Wuming's request. Wuming fell silent and could not help but sigh. Then, he turned to look at Gorgon. The black mud on Gorgon's body was like a living thing, and it was still squirming. Even the underworld, which was so eerie that it could not be described as a scenery, was ruined by it. However, Gorgon himself seemed to be steadily suppressed by Ereshkigal and did not seem to want to break free. From Ereshkigal's answer, Wuming was clear of two things. Ereshkigal was not as powerful as he imagined, and Gorgon's origin black mud was the same. Ereshkigal used the sacrifice divinity to suppress Gorgon, which meant that the origin black mud was not very effective in the hands of Gorgon. At least, Wuming could easily suppress Gorgon, and Ereshkigal did not have the confidence to suppress Gorgon, who was likely to go berserk under the threat of death. This proved that Ereshkigal's suppression was not foolproof. In this case, it also meant that there might be uncertainty in Ereshkigal's words. For example, when she said that, "I can continue to suppress Gorgon until my divinity completely disappears," there might also be uncertainty. Maybe in the next second, Ereshkigal's suppression on Gorgon would be broken. At that moment, Wuming no longer thought about it. The saying, "a long delay means trouble," was very reasonable. Wuming flew directly to Gorgon's heart, raised the blade of salvation in his hand, and aimed it at Gorgon's heart. Wuming was ready to smash a broken pot. Everything would work out when the time came. Anyway, he had smashed such a broken pot many times, so this time would not make a difference. Hey, don't be impulsive. I don't have the confidence to suppress Gorgon. Ereshkigal originally wanted to discuss with Wuming if there was any other way. In the end, Wuming rushed directly to Gorgon's heart, seemingly ready to directly stab that extraordinary weapon into Gorgon's heart. But what if Gorgon goes berserk? What if the black substance pollutes the underworld? Weren't you very worried before? Why are you suddenly not worried? A happy ending? Why don't you care about my life and death? Isn't this too cruel? Don't worry, my luck has always been very good. Wuming's implication was that with his luck, even if it was a broken pot, he could still smash it into a good pot. Huh? Ereshkigal was dumbfounded. Wuming dared to gamble, but Ereshkigal did not dare to gamble. Could he be more reliable? However, Wuming ignored Ereshkigal. Instead, he directly injected an unprecedented amount of magic power into the divine blade of salvation. Perhaps it was because the underworld was extremely dark, but the divine blade of salvation also emitted an unprecedented light. Suddenly, the entire underworld seemed to be illuminated by sunlight. The underworld, which had never seen the light of day from the beginning, was illuminated by light. The garrulous spirits hiding in the shadows were attracted by the light that scattered into the underworld, but because of the attribute restriction, they could not really touch the sunlight. They could only hide in the shadows and yearn for life. Even the undead yearned for the light full of life. No, it was more accurate to say that it was precisely because the undead had lost their lives that they yearned for the light that represented life. Not only the garrulous spirits, but Ereshkigal also had a change in her soul. My underworld is filled with light. Legend had it that Ereshkigal had no desires, but no one in the world could truly have no desires, not even the gods. The reason why Ereshkigal had no desires was because she knew that her desires were impossible to achieve. Over time, many of the desires that Ereshkigal desired were either forgotten by Ereshkigal or buried in the bottom of Ereshkigal's heart. Among them, illuminating the underworld with light was one of Ereshkigal's desires. All of a sudden, the huge garrulous spirit disappeared, and a blonde girl wearing a black and red cotton cloak and holding a spear of light appeared where the huge garrulous spirit had disappeared. If Wuming looked back now, he would find that the blonde girl's face and Ishtar's face were exactly the same. The two could be said to be sharing the same object. However, Wuming was not in the mood to pay attention to this at the moment. Like a wet blanket, he stabbed the divine blade of salvation straight into Gorgon's heart. Before stabbing, Wuming shouted at Ereshkigal without looking back. Ereshkigal, prepare to welcome Gorgon's rampage. Hey. Accompanied by Wuming's stern words and Ereshkigal's panicked voice, Gorgon, who was covered in black mud, began to struggle violently. The platform where the two were on began to shake violently. The stone pillar that Ereshkigal used to suppress Gorgon gradually cracked and then suddenly broke. Kacha, kacha, kacha! In just one exchange, almost half of the dozen huge stone pillars that suppressed Gorgon broke. Although the remaining half of the stone pillars were still intact, they were also cracked. With all the stone pillars broken, it was only a matter of time before Gorgon broke free. Please, Meslamtia? Chapter 984. Ereshkigal's clear, bell-like voice resounded throughout the underworld. With just this sentence, the majesty of the underworld's mistress was vividly displayed. Afterwards, Ereshkigal imbued almost all of her divinity into the light spear in her hand, Meslamthia. In an instant, the stone pillars that had been broken by Gorgon's struggle were restored, and the berserk Gorgon was once again suppressed. However, although she had successfully suppressed Gorgon again, the effect was not as effective as before. This was probably because Gorgon was currently under the threat of death. A large mouth split open on Gorgon's head, and an inhuman cry like that of a berserker came out from it. Gorgon's teeth, tongue, and other organs could not be seen in this mouth. It was pitch black, and it seemed that Gorgon's body was also filled with black mud. Countless snake hair mixed with black mud rippled around Gorgon's head. Probably because it was suppressed, although the snake hair fluttered, it was as if it was drunk and swaying. Not only that, the black mud flowed out from the cracks in the stone pillars and began to gradually cover the surrounding space. It seemed that the method of mending the pen after the sheep was lost could not be compared to the previous method. Hey, Hyunryong! Hurry up and think of something. I can't hold on for long. Ereshkigal gritted her teeth as she looked at Wuming, who was floating in the air. This was partly because Ereshkigal was dissatisfied with Wuming's inaction at the moment, and also because of the difficulty of forcefully suppressing Gorgon. Wuming ignored Ereshkigal's complaints and observed his surroundings. Kingu actually did not appear. Wuming said indifferently. That's right, Wuming was actually waiting for Kingu to appear. Wuming originally thought that Kingu would appear when Gorgon's life was in danger. After all, from all the previous signs, it was clear that Kingu's concern for Gorgon came from the bottom of his heart and was not fake. But strangely, when Gorgon's life was in danger, Kingu did not appear. After all, Wuming had chased Kingu into the underworld. Kingu must be here to help Gorgon. Why didn't he show himself? Wuming shook his head. Wuming did not have the luxury of time to think. Since Kingu was not going to show up, he would have to ask Gorgon to leave today. I am the strongest, and I hold victory in my hands. Be it human or demon, I am a person who can defeat all enemies, and I will defeat any enemy that stands in my way. Giants who possess unparalleled divine power, please help me. In an instant, Wuming's body exploded with extraordinary divine power. Golden light gathered on Wuming's right arm, forming a solid giant arm. Divinity! Ereshkigal was shocked. This was the underworld. Why wasn't the Hyunryong's divinity nullified? However, Wuming did not pay attention to Ereshkigal. Instead, he focused on Gorgon. Gorgon's rampage intensified as he sensed the threat of death. His huge body began to move violently as he once again let out that inhuman voice. It's over, Gorgon. Wuming used his huge golden right arm to hit Gorgon's heart. Only the hilt of the divine saber of salvation was exposed. In the next second, the divine saber of salvation that was wreaking havoc in Gorgon's heart sank into Gorgon's body. Then, Wuming released the true name of the divine saber of salvation, which had turned into his own noble artifact. Purify her, divine saber of salvation, Excalibur. The divine saber of salvation, which had completely sunk into Gorgon's heart, exploded with extreme power and reacted violently with Gorgon, who was completely covered by the black origin mud. This stimulation gave Gorgon a final burst of strength, and he instantly broke free from Ereshkigal's suppression. Ereshkigal slumped to the ground, and even Meslamtia fell out of her hand. The stone pillars around Gorgon were all shattered and turned into supersonic bullets, scattering in all directions. Just as they were about to hit the unprepared Ereshkigal, a figure blocked in front of Ereshkigal. This person was Wuming. Wuming raised the huge right arm of the giant incarnation and blocked Ereshkigal, helping Ereshkigal block the gravel that could have killed her at this moment. Thank you. Ereshkigal, who was sitting on the ground in a duck posture, was stunned, but she still blurted out the words of gratitude, although it was more or less unnatural. This made Wuming turn his head to look at Ereshkigal. Then, why did you save me? Probably a little embarrassed by Wuming's gaze, Ereshkigal asked a question that was baffling to Wuming. After Ereshkigal asked this question, Wuming turned his head back and looked at Gorgon, who was about to die. I don't need a reason to save people. Ereshkigal was shocked by Wuming's words. What kind of answer was that? There was nothing wrong with that statement, but Ereshkigal did not think that this sentence was suitable for Wuming. Wuming immediately changed his words. I can't leave you in the lurch. You and I fought against Gorgon together, so we can be considered as half a comrade. Moreover, I am Ishtar's teacher. Even if we have only met twice, you are still Ishtar's sister, so you can be considered as half a student of mine. Wuming was implying that it was natural for teachers to protect their students. However, Ereshkigal thought that these reasons were a little far-fetched. Wuming naturally understood that these words were indeed far-fetched. In fact, Wuming's real reason was that he believed that there was a hidden reason why Ereshkigal became the enemy of mankind. Wuming didn't think that a person who would subconsciously say thank you to someone who helped him was a bad person. If such a person was a bad person, then those who really committed all kinds of crimes didn't even deserve to be called a bad person. Although Wuming had a real reason, Wuming would not say it out loud because it would be disrespectful to Ereshkigal. I think you were forced. I think you are a good person, so I chose to save you. If Wuming said that, it would seem a little self-righteous. Although in Ereshkigal's opinion, Wuming was already very self-righteous. In short, the reason was not important. Wuming saved Ereshkigal, that was all. After understanding this point, Ereshkigal did not say anything else. Instead, she and Wuming looked at Gorgon. Gorgon's final radiance had ended. The black mud that covered Gorgon's body and the divine blade of salvation that erupted from Gorgon's heart had all been destroyed. Gorgon appeared in front of Wuming and Ereshkigal. Chapter 985. Hyunryong, you've won this time. As the saying goes, when a man is about to die, his words are kind. Gorgon, who was not a connate demon, was no exception. Gorgon, who realized that he was hopeless, did not have the viciousness of an avenger. Instead, he revealed the serenity of a young girl. At this moment, Gorgon's serenity reminded Wuming of two people. One was Anna and the other was naturally Athena in the Godslayer world. It had to be said that the pseudo-three-eyed lowly had always been quite serene. In the end, Athena in that world was also Gorgon. After all, they were a trinity. The reason why Athena's clone in the Godslayer world became a demon was because of the changes in the inheritance of that world. The gods in the Godslayer world were bound by the inheritance of humans. Originally, they were powerful existences that were not gods. In order to protect themselves, humans used myths to bind these powerful existences. Later, because the matriarchal clan changed into a patrilineal clan, the myths were modified, and the gods bound by the myths were also changed. The reason why Gorgon in the Emun world was born was because of humans. If it weren't for those guys who dreamed of being a hero every day and went on a crusade against the three sisters who were gods, Medusa wouldn't have gone berserk from the slaughter and devoured her two sisters, eventually becoming a hero killer, the monster Gorgon. However, if there was good, there would be evil. This evil corresponded to the good of humans. As long as the human race existed, this would never change. Now that he thought about it, there were many reasons why Anna appeared in this singularity. The most obvious one was that Anna's real name was related to Gorgon. Although Anna had never told anyone her real name, Wuming already knew about Anna's identity. After all, Wuming had seen Anna in Winterwood. Wuming estimated that Gadotsi and the others should have guessed Anna's real name by now. It was just that everyone tacitly did not mention it. According to Wuming's understanding, Gadotsi and the others were the kind of people who would not pursue the matter as long as the other party did not voluntarily reveal their real names. The possibility of Anna revealing her real name was also not high. Because Gorgon was about to leave, in a sense, there was no need for Anna to reveal her real name. As for the other point that Wuming guessed, it was because of the Holy Grail that Wuming left behind in this singularity. I wonder if Kinga did anything to the Holy Grail, Wuming muttered. Gorgon saw that Wuming was obviously thinking about something else. Although she knew that Wuming had neglected her, she was not angry at all. It was almost time for her to leave. A shattered wound appeared where Gorgon's heart was. The cracks spread from Gorgon's heart to Gorgon's whole body. It seemed that Gorgon was about to leave. Gorgon, where did you get this black mud? The sound of Gorgon's body shattering attracted Wuming's attention. He had a lot of questions. At the very least, he needed to let Gorgon do something before he left. However, Gorgon did not know why he smiled at this question. This is Tiamat's power. After Gorgon said this, he did not say anything else. The cracks on Gorgon's body grew bigger and bigger, as if they would shatter in the next second. Tiamat's power. Wuming muttered silently. Gorgon's answer did not satisfy Wuming. Wuming mainly wanted to know if Gydia did anything to this singularity. The Mesopotamia singularity was a time point before Gydia's time. The formation of this singularity was also personally arranged by Gydia. This already showed how special this singularity was. At least, it was more special than the previous 6 singularities. However, starting from the 5th singularity, Gydia and Wuming began to fight openly and covertly. Gydia created many holy grails and threw them into the 5th singularity in an attempt to use the various follower forces to cause trouble for Wuming, Chaldea, and the others. In the end, Gydia happened to enter the 5th Mesopotamia as one of the forces. In the end, not only did Gydia not cause much trouble for Wuming, Chaldea, and the others, but Wuming also found Gydia's hiding place and fought him. Although Wuming lost his body because of this, Gydia did not have it easy either. This was certain. However, because Wuming's body fell into another world, and because the flow of time in each world was different, Wuming was not in a hurry to find his body. At the very least, Gydia would take much longer to recover than Wuming. Probably because Gydia knew how powerful Wuming was, Gydia did not do anything to the 6th singularity. Gydia was also a smart person. If what happened at the 5th singularity was Gydia looking down on Wuming, then after the 5th singularity ended and Wuming came to fight with Gydia, Gydia no longer looked down on Wuming. He knew that his little tricks could not affect Wuming, so he simply did not care. The 6th singularity was like that. From Floro's words, Wuming vaguely learned that Gydia did not know that multiple demon god pillars had come to the 6th singularity. It could be said that this was completely done by Floros and the other demon god pillars. However, Floros probably did not expect to kill Wuming. Floros was not stupid. At most, he wanted to stall for time. However, who would have thought that Wuming was serious about Floros' little trick this time? In the end, Floros was stripped from the concept of the 72 demon god pillars, and was sealed into the Holy Grail by Wuming. In addition, Wuming and one of the strongest in the 6th singularity, Artoria, were old acquaintances. Moreover, he had the help of the crown assassin, the old man of the mountain, Hassan Sabah, although the old man basically did not make a move. Wuming, who realized the principle of take advantage of the situation, found his body in the box world. Moreover, because of the long time in the box world, Wu-Ming was about to reach adulthood. He was only one step away, which was a pleasant surprise. Wu-Ming did not believe that Gidia was his opponent now. After the matter of the seventh singularity was over and all singularities were repaired, Wu-Ming would settle the score with Gidia. In short, although Wu-Ming did not think that Gidia would do anything to the seventh singularity, the black soil that Gorgon had made Wu-Ming suspicious. But since Gorgon said that it was Tiamat's authority, then it might really be Tiamat's authority. Putting aside whether Gorgon knew about Gidia's matter, even if Gorgon knew, if Gorgon did not want to say, Wu-Ming would not force him. Just like how Wu-Ming knew that Gorgon did not know that Anna had descended as a servant, he would not tell Gorgon about Anna. Chapter 986. As Wu-Ming pondered, Gorgon's body cracked even more. Finally, without saying a word, Gorgon's huge body shattered and turned into mana particles that dissipated in the underworld. At this point, the magical beast goddess who had wreaked havoc in Mesopotamia for half a year was killed in an extremely aggrieved manner by having her heart pierced by an enemy while she was unprepared. At the same time, in the southwest forest, in the territory of the feathered serpent god, Anna, who had been injured by fighting against Uxia-Mughar, suddenly looked in a certain direction in the north, as if she had telepathically sensed something. The cloaked girl hugged her body with both hands and looked as if she did not know what to do. She muttered silently. Gorgon, in the underworld, Wu-Ming did not feel proud or guilty about killing Gorgon. After all, even if they were to fight face to face, he could still kill Gorgon. It would just be a little more troublesome. It could only be said that it was a matter of luck. Who would have thought that Gorgon would come to the underworld? Who would have thought that Ereshkigal would join forces with Wu-Ming? Who would have thought that Wu-Ming would take advantage of Ereshkigal's restraining of Gorgon to send the divine blade of salvation into Gorgon's heart? This was the so-called time and fate. With a wave of his hand, Wu-Ming took the divine blade of salvation into his hand and raised it high. Light once again shone on the underworld, but this time the light was gentler than before. When Gorgon broke free, some of the black soil flowed into the underworld. Wu-Ming was responsible for dealing with it. No, it should be said that only Wu-Ming, who had mastered the power of the source, could completely eliminate the black soil. Ereshkigal, who was behind Wu-Ming, once again fell into a daze because of the light shining on the underworld. After a short while, the remaining black soil of the underworld was cleaned up by Wu-Ming. The light disappeared and Wu-Ming put away the divine blade of salvation. Wu-Ming turned around and looked at Ereshkigal, who was still sitting on the ground in a daze. "What are you doing? Why are you in a daze?" Wu-Ming's words brought Ereshkigal back to her senses, and she immediately lowered her head. Although the underworld was still dark, Wu-Ming could still see Ereshkigal's red cheeks due to embarrassment. However, Wu-Ming was also used to Ereshkigal's girlish behavior. She was much more pleasing to the eye than Ishtar. "Ereshkigal, what are you going to do next?" Ereshkigal was a little confused. What did he mean by, "What are you going to do next?" Well, let me ask another question. Gorgon, one of the three goddesses, has left. I have also drawn the other pillar goddess to the human side. Now you are the only enemy left. The alliance between the three goddesses has indirectly collapsed. Are you going to continue attacking the Uruk, or are you going to stop? Ereshkigal was obviously stunned by Wu-Ming's words. She had never thought about this question. After all, no matter who it was, humans were unable to resist the gods. Therefore, the end result would be a certain pillar goddess attacking the Uruk, seizing the Uruk's cup, and finally facing the attack of the remaining two goddesses. Just like Merlin's analysis of Gadotsi and the others' narration before, the three goddesses would ultimately have to rely on force to decide the outcome. In the end, who would have thought that one of them would leave and another would be instigated, leaving Ereshkigal alone? You want to create a kingdom of death, right? Why would you have such an idea? Since the underworld existed, the souls of those who died in the battle in the past 6 months would come to the underworld. Not only that, but the people of Khazar City had also inexplicably died overnight. This was undoubtedly Ereshkigal's doing, and from the number of souls in the spear cages that Wuming had seen when he entered the underworld twice, those people must have been imprisoned there. It was obvious that Ereshkigal wanted to create a kingdom of death. Even if Wuming's guess was not completely correct, it was probably not far from the truth. Ereshkigal did not speak. Instead, she remained silent and slowly lowered her head. Do you want to protect the humans? If the human body could not be protected, then at least the human soul could be preserved. Ereshkigal probably had this idea in mind when she joined the alliance of the 3 goddesses. Ereshkigal suddenly raised her head and looked at Wuming with astonishment as if to say, "How did you know?" However, Wuming replied with a natural smile. At this point, if Wuming still could not figure it out, how stupid would he be? People say that the female ruler of the underworld, Ereshkigal, is the goddess of fear. I originally thought so too, but in the 2 times that I came into contact with you, I didn't find how terrifying you are. I think the reason why people think so is only because they are afraid of the death that you control. If a person looked fierce and was very solitary and had no friends, even if this person's heart was kinder than anyone else's, there would definitely be people around who judged people by their appearance. Then, this person would inevitably be regarded as a bad person because of his fierce appearance. In addition, this person was solitary and had no friends. After rumors spread, this person's identity as a bad person would be confirmed. Ereshkigal was probably the same. Because she was the female ruler of the underworld and controlled death, coupled with the fact that Ereshkigal could not leave the underworld and could not show her kind side to people, this caused people on the land to be more and more afraid of Ereshkigal. The name of the mother goddess of fear was passed down. It was precisely because people thought of her as the mother goddess of fear that Ereshkigal would dress up as the mother goddess of fear. Because her heart was not the character of the mother goddess of fear, she did not pretend to be the mother goddess of fear in time when she discovered Wuming. Instead, she maintained her original character. Because of this, Ereshkigal panicked because she was afraid that the secret of her disguise as the mother goddess of fear would be discovered. How could a girl who would try her best to play such a role because of rumors and panicked and broke her disguise, when her little secret was discovered, be a bad person? And the most important point, a person who will subconsciously say thank you to others. I really don't think such a person is the so-called mother goddess of fear. Ereshkigal was much better than Ishtar in this way. Since Wuming had said so much, no matter how stupid Ereshkigal was, she could understand that Wuming had almost figured it out, even if he was just guessing. Then Ereshkigal spoke. You're right. I don't want to destroy the Uruk like Gorgon. I only want to protect the souls of humans. Evil will also help humans in evil ways. This is my way. Chapter 987. Wuming thought to himself, sure enough. Learning from Ereshkigal and guessing on your own were 2 completely different things. When Ereshkigal admitted it, Wuming was also relieved. After all, this could prove that Ereshkigal and Quetzalcoatl were the same. They were both gods who cared about humans but used special methods to save them. So, back to my previous question, what are you going to do next? The only evil god in the 3 goddesses' alliance who wanted to destroy humans had already left, and the other good god had long been instigated by Wuming. In the 3 goddesses' alliance, only Ereshkigal was left. It was natural that Wuming would ask Ereshkigal what she was going to do next. However, Ereshkigal sighed. The force suppression of Gorgon just now consumed almost all of my divinity, and my behavior just now could be considered to have caused harm to Gorgon. The covenant of the 3 goddesses' alliance is not something I can defy. At this moment, I am only able to survive because of the relationship between the underworld and me. If it was not for the connection between the underworld and me that allowed me to survive, you might not be able to see me. I think you should be very clear about this point. After all, in Ereshkigal's view, it was inconceivable that Wuming could not detect the changes in her now. Indeed, as Ereshkigal said, Wuming had actually been aware of the changes in Ereshkigal's body at this moment. The divinity in Ereshkigal's body had almost completely disappeared, and Ereshkigal's spiritual base had also become extremely fragile, as if it would break with a touch. Ereshkigal immediately asked, "Why don't you just kill me directly? Right now, I am extremely weak. After all, I am a member of the Three Goddesses Alliance, an enemy of mankind." What Ereshkigal meant was that once she was killed, there would be no follow-up troubles. There would be no need to ask what Ereshkigal was going to do next, and there would be no need to worry that Ereshkigal would continue to deal with the humans. After she was killed, the Three Goddesses Alliance would truly collapse, and the humans would be saved. This singularity would also be fine. It was simply a profitable business. However, Wuming shook his head. "I can even spare the good gods who do evil, so why can't I spare the evil gods who do good?" Ereshkigal was stunned. She knew that Wuming was comparing her to Ishtar. Indeed, although Ishtar was a good god, Ishtar often did some evil things. Although the degree of evil was not high, the sentence, "Do not do evil because it is small," was always useful. On the other hand, Ereshkigal was an evil god in name, but she joined the Three Goddesses Alliance to deal with the humans in a roundabout way. She thought that she could not save Mesopotamia, so in order to save the humans, she chose to collect the souls of the humans and store them in the underworld to save them. Ereshkigal's approach was somewhat similar to that of Artoria, who had the Holy Lance, but after all, they were different. After all, Ereshkigal only preserved the souls of the humans. Ishtar and Ereshkigal were different sides of the same divinity, so it was natural to compare them. The enemy of the humans is not the Three Goddesses Alliance. The only enemy of the humans is the goddess of warcraft. Ereshkigal and Quizard did not join the Three Goddesses Alliance with the purpose of destroying the humans. They joined the Three Goddesses Alliance to help and save the humans. "But, Gorgon has already been destroyed by you, right?" Without talking about the goddess of warcraft, Wuming directly answered Ereshkigal on the other hand. "Didn't I say that I am Ishtar's teacher, and you are Ishtar's sister, so you are also half my disciple. The mistakes made by the disciple should be corrected and made up for by the teacher. Although it is natural for the teacher to punish the disciple, your safety is also part of my responsibility. After knowing your secret, if I still choose to kill you, then it is really my fault. And if Ishtar knows about it, she will not forgive me." Regardless of whether these words were true or false, Wuming was not prepared to destroy Ereshkigal. Wuming's meaning was very clear, so how could Ereshkigal not understand? Suddenly, some tears appeared in Ereshkigal's eyes. This was the first time someone cared about her. But if Wuming knew what Ereshkigal was thinking, he would probably laugh it off. With Ereshkigal's EQ, which was raised as a young lady who did not know about the world because she stayed in the underworld for a long time, she probably would not realize that someone cared about her. For example, Ishtar, who was actually very concerned about her half. However, one was too arrogant and did not show any concern, while the other's EQ was too low and did not notice the other's concern. This caused both of them to not realize the other's meaning, which was really regrettable. And the most important reason, then, Wuming's tone changed. "The goddess of warcraft is still alive." Huh! Ereshkigal was dumbfounded. Could it be that Gorgon was fake? Was that why Kingu did not come to save her? But that was impossible. Gorgon was completely real to Ereshkigal. How could he be fake? Then, Wuming answered Ereshkigal's doubts. "The real goddess of warcraft is Tiamat." And Ereshkigal was stunned. But Wuming naturally knew what Ereshkigal wanted to say. She was just asking for the reason. The reason is that the fake Enkidu's body allowed me to kill Gorgon. Wuming's eyes narrowed. Huh! What kind of reason was that? I've seen Gorgon and Kingu a few times before. I can feel that Kingu cares about Gorgon from the bottom of his heart. It's not fake. Ereshkigal expressed her opinion. Oh, you also call the fake Kingu? Ereshkigal understood what Wuming meant. Of course, she knew that the fake Kingu was not the real goddess of Warcraft. That's what he calls himself. Let's just call him that for now. Ereshkigal sighed helplessly, probably because she felt helpless about Wuming's seriousness. Then let's call him Kingu. It didn't matter if he called the fake Enkidu or Kingu. After all, it was just a small matter. There was no need to harp on it. The key was the relationship between Kingu and Gorgon. As you said, Kingu's feelings for Gorgon are real. Then why did Kingu allow Gorgon to leave? Wuming followed Kingu into the underworld, but Kingu was nowhere to be found. This was very strange. Ereshkigal was speechless. Indeed, Kingu's feelings for Gorgon were real. But if that was the case, why did Kingu abandon Gorgon? The only answer is that Kingu's feelings are not for Gorgon, but for the goddess of Warcraft. Chapter 988. It was obviously wrong to say that Gorgon, who held part of Tiamat's authority, was not the goddess of magical beasts. However, it was also wrong to say that Gorgon was the goddess of magical beasts, because Gorgon did not have the authority to give birth to magical beasts. Gorgon had only borrowed Tiamat's authority. That was why Kingu often called himself the son of the goddess of magical beasts, and not Gorgon's son. Even if Gorgon is dead, the goddess of magical beasts is still alive. That's why Kingu abandoned Gorgon. The underworld extended in all directions, and there were many stone pillars and bridges. It was not difficult to circle around Wuming and return to the surface. Meanwhile, Wuming was chasing after Gorgon and Funbaba, and neglected Kingu. Ereshkigal was suppressing Gorgon at the time, so it was normal that she did not notice Kingu's location. Ereshkigal closed her eyes for a few seconds before opening them again. There is no sign of Kingu in the underworld, only a trace left behind by him. Ereshkigal was, after all, the ruler of the underworld, and it was not difficult for her to detect the creatures in the underworld. It's just as you said. Kingu abandoned Gorgon. Ereshkigal could not help but sigh. Although they were on different sides, Ereshkigal felt a little sad for Gorgon. No matter how many excuses he had, Kingu betrayed Gorgon. Betrayal was the only thing that made one's heart turn cold. This was a topic that no matter which dynasty, whether human or god, would sigh endlessly. Then, Ereshkigal realized a problem. Wait. If the goddess of magical beasts is not Gorgon, but Mother, where would Mother be hiding? The Mesopotamia looked very big, but it was only a small area. The surface of the Mesopotamia was divided according to the forces, and most of the underground was occupied by Ereshkigal's underworld and Zhuge, Kong Ming's noble phantasm. Tiamat's body was extremely huge, and it was said that her body was that of the dragon god. There was no place for her to hide. There was another important point. Tiamat was once exiled by the gods into the void, and it was not a place where one could casually come and go. If Tiamat could come out of the void, she would not have come out at the end of the gods' era. Ereshkigal's words reminded Wuming of the Persian Gulf. The dream he had about Tiamat was that he was in an ocean full of black mud. At that time, Wuming fell asleep near the Persian Gulf, and the Persian Gulf was connected to the Indian Ocean. It was easy for it to accommodate Tiamat's legendary huge body. Therefore, Tiamat was most likely hiding in the Persian Gulf. At the very least, she was hiding in the virtual space of the Persian Gulf. However, Wuming agreed with the former. Tiamat will definitely come out of the void. There is no doubt about that. Tiamat's authority was not so easy to take. If Tiamat was still in the void, even with the help of the Holy Grail, Gorgon would not be able to bless himself with Tiamat's authority. Wuming guessed that it was probably because of the collapse of human reason, coupled with Gidea's tricks, such as borrowing the power of the Holy Grail, that Tiamat successfully escaped from the void. For some unknown reason, she was sleeping somewhere in this world. Kingu was either simply there to meet up with Tiamat, or he was there to awaken the sleeping Tiamat. Wuming believed that it was the former. The black mud only appeared on Gorgon's body, and it did not invade the land. This means that Tiamat definitely hasn't come to this land yet, or she is also sleeping. In this regard, Ereshkigal nodded in agreement. If Tiamat had appeared in Mesopotamia, perhaps humanity would have been finished long ago, and they would still be able to resist for half a year. As the only native god in Mesopotamia's Sumer pantheon, it could be said that no one understood Tiamat's power better than Ereshkigal. Although she wasn't like Ishtar who could freely roam the world, Ereshkigal wasn't the kind of person who didn't care about worldly affairs. Ereshkigal was indeed quite reclusive, but not to mention that the garrulous spirit would bring her news of the surface, as her divine authority. Peddling would also tell Ereshkigal stories of the surface from time to time, whether it was about humans or gods. Otherwise, if Ereshkigal had stayed in the underworld for tens of thousands of years, she wouldn't have gone crazy from boredom. At the very least, Ereshkigal wouldn't be like a young lady who lived in a boudoir like she was now. It had to be said that time could erase the soul of an intelligent creature, but it could also erase the soul of a god. It was rare for Ereshkigal, who could only stay underground and endure the curse of being imprisoned, to have the temperament of a young lady. If Ishtar and Ereshkigal were to exchange identities, perhaps Ishtar would be imprisoned for a long time and her soul would collapse and become an evil god. Of course, this was only an if. After all, Ishtar's personality was cultivated. If they were to exchange identities from the beginning, the outcome would be unpredictable. All in all, Ereshkigal was a god after all. Even if she didn't understand the affairs of the humans on the surface, she wouldn't and couldn't not understand the affairs of the god. Gods wouldn't change for millions of years, unlike humans who would change dynasties in less than 100 years or even a dozen years. The mother has an ability called aminogeese, also known as cell coercion. It can transform the captured life forms into creatures that will completely obey the mother's orders and become the enemy of humans. This is the mother's most powerful and terrifying ability. Hearing Ereshkigal's explanation, Wuming felt that this was similar to the black root mud. This was probably why Ereshkigal could still remain calm after Gorgon admitted that the black root mud was Tiamat's authority. However, Ereshkigal didn't know that the black root mud in Gorgon's body was the black root mud. Wuming wouldn't mistake it. What was strange was that Gorgon clearly possessed the black root mud, but Gorgon said that it was Tiamat's authority. After all, Ereshkigal was a cornerstone that had been in the underworld since birth. It wasn't surprising that the black root mud Gorgon mentioned was Tiamat's authority. It could only be said that either Gorgon was lying, or Tiamat possessed the black root mud. In other words, her own authority had fused with the black root mud, which had a very similar effect. This wasn't good news. Chapter 989. After all, Wuming was not a native god of Sumer. Naturally, he did not know about Tiamat's crazy ability. But after Wuming thought of his trump card, he was relieved. After all, there was no need to panic. Wuming looked at Ereshkigal again. Move the underworld to a safe place. This way, Tiamat will not endanger you. As long as the underworld was moved to the north or below the mountains, as long as the underworld was not connected to the surface, Tiamat would not affect Ereshkigal underground. However, Wuming's words made Ereshkigal unhappy. I am also on the side of humans. Don't think of me as the same as Ishtar. Hearing Ereshkigal's complaint, Wuming could not help but smile. First of all, Ereshkigal did not understand Ishtar. Ishtar would not run away at such a critical moment for the survival of humans. Probably in Ereshkigal's mind, Ishtar was the greedy goddess who was addicted to treasures and overestimated herself. Second of all, Wuming also felt gratified for Ereshkigal. Ereshkigal's words also represented that Ereshkigal had answered Wuming's question. In short, it was good that Ereshkigal had the heart. Anyway, she could not do the specific thing. After all, you can't leave the underworld. There's no doubt about that. This was a hard point. Moreover, your spirit base is now so fragile that it can be broken with a light touch. Wuming's meaning was clear. Ereshkigal could not even protect herself. How could she help others? This, Ereshkigal once again fell into a state of embarrassment and blushed. This was something that couldn't be helped. After all, Wuming was right. Just stay in the underworld obediently. When the surface can't hold on any longer, I'll come to you for help. At that time, you won't be able to refuse even if you want to. Wuming said jokingly. Then, in a flash, he appeared on top of Funbaba. Remember to release the souls of the citizens of Kuza. Their bodies are still intact in the bottom level of the Uruk's divine tower. As for those who died in battle, they were truly dead. Even if their souls were released, they could not be resurrected. Alright, I got it. Probably no one had ever treated Ereshkigal so rudely before. This made Ereshkigal a little uncomfortable. She didn't even know how to react. But at the same time, Ereshkigal felt a little inferior to herself. Her whole face showed an "I'm very sad" atmosphere. Wuming, who was sitting on Funbaba's back, saw Ereshkigal's expression. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Ishtar was a little childish. Then, Wuming suddenly said, "You're Ishtar's sister. No matter what, you have to be more elegant than Ishtar." Elegant? Ereshkigal silently analyzed this word. While Ereshkigal was analyzing elegance, Wuming silently chanted a sentence. "With my spirit of speech, let the justice of the world appear." A golden short sword appeared in Wuming's hand. Since Ereshkigal was not confident, then he would help her. After all, he was half a disciple. Then, Wuming stabbed himself with the golden short sword. Ereshkigal was so scared that she couldn't speak. Was he trying to commit suicide? But then, Ereshkigal found a new problem. Why can you still use your authority in the underworld? Ereshkigal could feel that the golden short sword in Wuming's hand was a god's authority. But this was the underworld. If divinity was ineffective here, then naturally, authority would be ineffective. However, Ereshkigal immediately realized a problem. Since Wuming could use his divine authority, didn't that mean that Wuming could take her down when they first met? After all, in terms of divinity, Ereshkigal could only be considered a mid-tier god. Wuming was a foreign god that even the God King had to respect. There was no doubt that he could take her down. At that moment, Ereshkigal's face turned red. It was a pity that she had pretended to be the goddess of fear to scare him. In the end, he didn't mind at all. He didn't give her face as the queen of the underworld. Seeing Ereshkigal's face turn red, Wuming guessed Ereshkigal's thoughts. He shook his head indifferently. It was just a girl's temperament. There was no need to care. In the next second, the golden short sword that pierced Wuming's body disappeared. A ball of light appeared at the spot where the golden short sword pierced. "This is for you. I don't really need it." With that, Wuming threw the ball of light to Ereshkigal. Then, Wuming opened a huge portal. Funbaba understood and jumped in directly. Ereshkigal, who subconsciously caught the ball of light, hugged it with both hands. It could be said that Ereshkigal was still sitting on the ground at this moment. If Ereshkigal was standing, she would definitely stagger a few steps when she caught the ball of light. Ereshkigal looked up in Wuming's direction. There was only a portal that had shrunk to the size of a fist left. Then, Ereshkigal looked down at the ball of light in her arms. With this look, Ereshkigal suddenly found something wrong. This is divinity? Ereshkigal immediately panicked. Wuming had given his divinity as the Hyunryong to Ereshkigal. The golden short sword could cut the enemy's power. Naturally, it could also cut Wuming's own. Wuming had used the golden short sword to cut his own divinity. Just as Wuming had said, Wuming had no use for this thing. His own power did not come from the divinity that was added by the legend of the Hyunryong. Therefore, to Wuming, this divinity did not matter to him. Ereshkigal's divinity had almost completely disappeared. The spirit base was only hanging on by a thread because of the underworld. It was obvious that Ereshkigal needed this more than Wuming. Divinity can be given away? Ereshkigal was stunned. She had never heard of a god giving away their own divinity. Could it be that Wuming's power had been weakened? Ereshkigal, who did not know what was going on, could not help but frown. She was not going to use it. She was going to find a chance to return it to Wuming. It was fine if she could not help him, but how could she drag him down? However, in the next second, the divinity that belonged to the Hyunryong slid into Ereshkigal's body. Suddenly, Ereshkigal was surrounded by a golden light. Chapter 990. Huh! Ereshkigal was confused once again. However, there was something else that made Ereshkigal even more confused. Beside Ereshkigal, there was a black-haired little girl wearing a robe and holding a staff. The little girl looked at Ereshkigal, and Ereshkigal looked at the little girl. The two of them stared at each other. Brother Wuming? The little girl looked at Ereshkigal with a tone of speculation, disbelief, and suspicion. Brother Wuming? Ereshkigal repeated the little girl's words, and showed an even more surprised expression. Who is Brother Wuming? On the surface of Mesopotamia, in a dense forest far away from the underworld, a huge black-purple ripple appeared here, and then a huge green creature walked out, and there was an extraordinary figure sitting on its back. The two of them were Funbaba and Wuming, who left through the portal. And this dense forest was Quizzard's territory. Pa! Wuming snapped his fingers and closed the portal. Even the rules of the underworld could not restrict Wuming, so the underworld naturally could not restrict Wuming. Ereshkigal is really an interesting person. It's a pity that I can't stay for a while longer. Wuming recalled Ereshkigal's shocked expression, and his face was filled with joy. Woo-woo, Funbaba called out twice, and it seemed like it did not understand Wuming's words. Wuming laughed and then shook his head. It was normal for Funbaba not to understand Wuming's joy, and Ereshkigal might not understand Wuming's meaning. But then, Wuming could not laugh anymore. This was because Wuming felt an unusually large magical power coming from the east. That's the Persian Gulf. In an instant, Wuming guessed the source of such a large magical power. It's Tiamat, right? Gorgon's possession of Tiamat's power was not a simple possession, but a sharing. Only a shared death could make Tiamat immediately wake up, or rather, wake up. This was probably Kingu's goal. Kingu wanted Tiamat to appear, and Wuming wanted to end this singularity as soon as possible. I have to hurry. Although Silent Wonder had never seen Tiamat before and did not know how powerful she was, Silent Wonder would not underestimate her. Before Wuming's trump card was ready, he had to make some preparations to deal with Tiamat. Wuming thought as he released his mental power. After determining his current location, he retracted his mental power. Wuming found himself in the northwest part of the forest. This was the place where Wuming and Merlin met up on their way to Eridu. This could not be helped. Funbaba was too large to appear in the city, and Wuming had only stayed in this forest other than Eric Metropolis and UR. I wonder if the demonic beasts here have been eliminated, Wuming thought. Then, Wuming pointed in the direction of Eridu to Funbaba. Let's go, we'll head there. Heading towards Eridu, they would know the situation. Woo woo woo, Funbaba cried out again, and then ran in the direction Wu Ming pointed. Funbaba was obviously a huge existence, but it was like a fish in water. It did not knock down any trees in this forest. This was probably the talent of Funbaba as a forest beast. On the way, Wu Ming and Funbaba took advantage of this short idle time to chat. After all, even if the situation was critical, it was useless to be anxious. It was better to temporarily pin the hope of stopping Tiamat on Gilgamesh, while Wu Ming went to the battlefield in the forest to meet up with Gudatsi. Speaking of which, why did you run to my temple? I left you behind to help them, but you ended up sleeping in my temple. Although Funbaba looked bloated, it was probably due to the pressure from Tiamat. At this moment, Funbaba's speed was not slow at all. The rapid airflow flowed past Wu Ming's face. If it was an ordinary person, they might have suffocated. However, no matter how fast the airflow was, Wu Ming's words fell into Funbaba's ears. Woo woo woo, so that's how it is. It's not used to being away from Yggdrasil, so it fell asleep. This was something that Wu Ming did not expect. After all, Funbaba was a mythological beast, and not a life in Yggdrasil. In Wu Ming's opinion, even if Funbaba was separated from Yggdrasil, it would not be a big problem. However, who would have thought that Funbaba had been fused with Yggdrasil for a long time, and the sudden separation would have a mental impact on Funbaba? Fortunately, the impact was not big. Then you come back first, Wu Ming said, opened the dragon nest space, and took out Yggdrasil. Wu Ming did not mean to let Funbaba return to Yggdrasil. Wu Ming meant to let Yggdrasil integrate into Funbaba's body. The two had already formed a symbiotic relationship, and it was not a problem at all who was in whose body. Wu Ming held Yggdrasil in a reverse grip and stabbed Yggdrasil into Funbaba's body that was full of green hair, but there was no bloody scene. The moment Yggdrasil came into contact with Funbaba, it turned into energy from the spearhead and integrated into Funbaba's body bit by bit. After Funbaba accepted Yggdrasil, it seemed to have strengthened a lot, and its speed became faster. Stop. Suddenly, Wu Ming made Funbaba stop. The reason why Wu Ming suddenly stopped was that Wu Ming smelled blood, and it was the blood of a demonic beast. The blood of a demonic beast was not the same as human blood, so it had a different smell from human blood. Wu Ming could naturally smell it in an instant. As for Funbaba, whose sense of smell was more sensitive than Wu Ming's, it had already smelled the scent of a demonic beast, but they were all dead, so Funbaba did not report it to Wu Ming. Wu Ming closed his eyes and spread out his mental strength. In an instant, the nearby scene appeared in his mind. On the side of Wu Ming, a large number of trees had collapsed and were destroyed. One after another, demonic beast corpses were lying among the destroyed trees. A large amount of purple blood stained the ground and the destroyed trees. Not only that, but even the surrounding intact woods also had demonic beast corpses. And in the center of the collapsed area, a huge red demonic beast was lying there, its head separated from its body. Most of the purple blood in this area was actually provided by this huge demonic beast. Demonic beast commander? Wu Ming frowned. The size of an ordinary demonic beast could not reach that level. Only a demonic beast commander could explain this. Judging from the death of the demonic beast commander, Gudatsi and the others must have won. Chapter 991. Gudatsi and the others had most likely returned to Eric Metropolis, but he didn't know how many casualties there were. However, Wu Ming couldn't go to Eric Metropolis right now. Wait for me here. Wu Ming exhorted and leaped into the air above the forest, heading towards the battlefield. Funbaba, who nodded to indicate understood, found a relatively large rock, climbed up, and rested. In the blink of an eye, Wu Ming arrived at the battlefield. Wu Ming frowned when he sensed the demonic beast commander through his mental power. It was because Wu-ming found a trace of abnormality in the wound of the demonic beast commander. It was because of this abnormality that Wu-ming didn't choose to go to Eric Metropolis directly. Wu-ming didn't care about the other demonic beasts and went straight to the corpse of the demonic beast commander. After inspecting the monster's corpse, Silent Cry found that there was a trace of death aura around the wound on its head. This aura was very similar to the aura of the underworld. Wu-ming, who had just left the underworld, wouldn't be mistaken. Immediately, Wu-ming made a judgment. This demonic beast commander was beheaded with a single slash. And to be able to behead it with a single slash and have a trace of death aura in the wound, only that guy could do it. The old man of the mountain, Hassan Sabah. Although there were many Hassans, the one Wu-ming was referring to was none other than the first Hassan, who was qualified to be an assassin. Wu-ming was the one who took a slash from that guy. It was normal for him to be able to easily recognize that the slash came from the first Hassan. No, it should be said that no matter who was slashed by the first Hassan, they would remember it. Since he's already here, I can finally relax. Although he was exaggerating the first Hassan was no ordinary person. In terms of assassination, Wu-ming did not dare to underestimate him. With the addition of Merlin, Gilgamesh, Zhuge Kongming, and Chaldea's Roman, these 4 think tanks, Wu-ming didn't have to worry as much. Let's go straight to Edu. Since Gudatsi and the rest were not here, Wu-ming did not need to continue using Funbaba. After Wu-ming finished speaking, he opened a teleportation gate and walked in. At the same time, a huge portal suddenly appeared under Funbaba, who was resting on a rock. Caught off guard, Funbaba fell into it. Woo woo woo! The portal suddenly closed, and Funbaba's frightened cry echoed in the forest. Near Eric Metropolis, in the Feathered Serpent Temple, 2 portals, one big and one small, opened. Wu-ming walked out of the small portal, while Funbaba fell out of the horizontal portal. Dong! Funbaba fell to the ground with a loud bang. The citizens of Eric Metropolis thought it was an earthquake. Woo woo woo! Funbaba lay on the ground and cried out. Its head rubbed against Wu-ming as if it was in pain. However, others did not understand Funbaba, but Wu-ming did. Funbaba was not hurt at all. It was just frightened and acted spoiled to Wu-ming. Okay, I apologize. I'm sorry, Funbaba. Wu-ming didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he stroked Funbaba's head and apologized in a funny tone. However, it was really useful. Funbaba immediately stood up, giving people the feeling that it had completely recovered. Whoa? Isn't this Lord Hyunryong? At this time, the leopard man suddenly appeared from a haystack and looked at Wu-ming and Funbaba with a silly expression. Wu-ming was not surprised that the leopard man came to greet him. Funbaba's fall from the portal to the ground made a lot of noise. As a leopard man who has an intuition beyond that of a beast, it is impossible for him not to discover it. In addition, the leopard man is lively and active. It must be her who came to greet Wu-ming and Funbaba. Leopard man, is Tachika Fujimaru still here? Without talking nonsense with the leopard man, Wu-ming asked concisely. She has already left, she went east. The leopard man pointed to the east, and there was a trace of seriousness in his seemingly silly eyes. It seems that the leopard man's intuition also detected the danger. Where is Quizzard? Wu-ming didn't believe that Quizzard couldn't detect the movement caused by Tiamat. Quizzard Koyatl just left. She went to find Tachika Fujimaru. A familiar light voice came from the other side of Wu-ming. Wu-ming turned his head and saw that it was indeed Anna. But the difference is that Anna seems to have something on her hand this time. Her body is wrapped with something similar to a bandage. Not only that, but Anna's hood is not worn. Cooker is worried about Tachika Fujimaru, so he rushed over to help Awu. Ignoring the leopard man, Wu-ming walked to Anna. Anna, are you okay? Faced with Wu-ming's concern, Anna shook her head. I accidentally suffered a minor injury when dealing with Uxia Mughar, and I have almost recovered. Uxiu Mughar? It's probably the name of the magical beast commander who was beheaded. And the reason why Anna stayed here is probably to recuperate. Then, Anna continued to speak. Merlin asked me to wait for you here. He said it's very urgent and he hopes you can make a judgment based on this. Anna said while taking out a clay tablet from under her cloak. So that's how it is. Not only is she recuperating, but she also works as a messenger. Wuming took it and found that the clay tablet was empty. Not only that, but it was also covered with a powerful illusion. If you forcibly look at it, you will fall into an illusion. Merlin, this guy. Wuming was a little speechless. This is simply superfluous. Merlin always likes to work on such meaningless things. A few Lune runes were inputted into the clay tablet by Wuming as if entering a password. The illusion suddenly disappeared, and the clay tablet was still empty. But then, some words directly appeared in Wuming's mind, and Wuming also subconsciously closed his eyes. In the next second, the clay tablet in Wuming's hand directly turned into yellow soil and scattered. Anna didn't say anything and quietly waited for Wuming to digest it. On the other hand, the leopard man and Funbaba foolishly mixed together. In an instant, Wuming opened his eyes. Let's go back to Uruk. This was Wuming's judgment. Anna nodded silently. In any case, Merlin told her to listen to Wuming's words. Although Anna didn't want to listen to Merlin, after all, Wuming was a reliable person, so Anna could only make do with it. Hearing Wuming's words, Funbaba also kicked the leopard man away and ran to Wuming's side, fully showing that she was on call. Good. Then I will also go to Uruk. The leopard man put his hands on his hips, showing an inexplicable sense of pride. Wuming looked at the leopard man with disdain, but Wuming still decided to bring the leopard man. In any case, she was still a goddess. Even if she wasn't as good as Quizzard and Ishtar, she would still play a role, right? However, at this moment, Wuming suddenly noticed that a large amount of magic that made Wuming feel disgusted was moving toward Eric Metropolis. Wuming had a bad feeling. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.